Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. John had been chasing stories for years, but this one felt different. It wasn't just another blog post about hidden gems or off-the-beaten-path destinations. This was something more. Elusive. He'd heard whispers about it from a fellow traveler in a pub somewhere far from home. A village so remote it barely appeared on maps, tucked away in the folds of a forgotten mountain range. Its name was Veraheim. There's something strange about that place, the traveler had said, his eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. People say the festival is. Not what it seems. Some even call it cursed. I wouldn't go if I were you. John had laughed it off, ordering another drink. After all, this was what he did. He sought the strange, the unknown, the unexplainable. Cursed? He thought just another local myth. But that's what made his blog popular. His willingness to explore the world's deepest corners, to uncover its secrets. And now, as the bus wound its way through the mountain roads, John was closer than ever to uncovering this mystery. The sun hung low in the sky as the bus chugged along the winding path, the tires humming softly over the rough terrain. John stared out the window, watching as the forest gave way to jagged peaks, their snow-capped tops piercing the clouds. The air had changed, colder and sharper. He felt the weight of isolation in the air, but it was the kind of isolation that intrigued him, not scared him. The bus finally arrived at the village late in the afternoon. Veraheim was smaller than he had imagined, just a handful of houses clustered around a central square. The buildings looked old, their wooden structures darkened by time, but they were meticulously kept, with small flower boxes hanging from windowsills and the scent of wood smoke curling from chimneys. In the distance, a towering mountain loomed over the village like a silent guardian. John stepped off the bus and adjusted the strap of his backpack. His eyes scanned the village, noting the strange absence of modern touches. No smartphones, no billboards, nothing to remind him of the outside world. He liked it. This was what he wanted to capture, a place untouched by time, where old ways still lived. A man approached him. He was middle-aged, his skin weathered from years in the sun, his clothes simple but clean. His face was kind but worn with an air of quiet caution, as if he had seen too many visitors like John come and go, asking too many questions. "You must be the traveler," the man said, his accent thick. "You've come just in time for the festival." John smiled, trying to be friendly. "I've heard a lot about this place. Thought I'd come see it for myself." The man nodded, his eyes lingering on John's face for a moment longer than usual. "It's an old tradition. You will see. But be careful. The festival is not for outsiders to understand." John felt a chill run down his spine, but he brushed it off as nothing more than the cold mountain air. "I'm here to learn. That's all." The man didn't smile. "Of course. We welcome you. You'll stay at the inn. Elder Marla will take care of you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving John standing alone in the village square. John made his way to the inn, a small, stone building with ivy creeping up its sides. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the warm scent of wood and something cooking wafted out to meet him. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of conversation and the soft clinking of glasses. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The innkeeper, a woman who appeared to be in her late 60s, looked up from behind the counter as John entered. She was tall, her face sharp and angular, with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her eyes, though, were what struck him most, deep, dark, and unreadable, as though she had lived through centuries of secrets. "Ah, the traveler," she said in a voice as smooth and calm as the evening breeze. "Welcome to Veraheim. I'm Elder Marla. I prepared a room for you." She led him up a narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath their feet. At the top, the village square. A large window framed the darkening sky and the distant peaks beyond, "I'm sure you'll be comfortable here," Elder Marlis said, her voice taking on a distant tone. "But remember, the festival begins tonight. You may find things unsettling." John glanced at her, sensing something in her words that didn't sit right with him. "What do you mean by unsettling?" Her gaze flickered to the door, as if considering whether to answer. Finally, she said, "The village has its ways. We do not speak of them openly. It is best you remain indoors after dark. Enjoy the festivities, but stay within the inn. Understand." There was no mistaking the finality in her voice. John didn't push, though his curiosity gnawed at him. He nodded, still wondering what exactly was going on in this strange place. That evening, he walked down to the village square again, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lanterns flickered to life, casting a soft glow over the cobblestone streets. Villagers in simple, worn clothes began to gather in the square, whispering quietly among themselves. Some of them glanced up at John with what he could only describe as guarded curiosity, but none of them spoke to him directly. John found a spot near the edge of the square, watching from a distance. As more people gathered, the atmosphere seemed to thicken, like the very air had grown heavier. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something off about the way they all stood so quietly, their faces almost expressionless. The center of the square was cleared, and a large stone altar stood there, draped in dark cloth. Villagers began to gather around it in a circle, forming a silent, solemn assembly. It was only then that John noticed the strange, intricate markings on their hands. Each hand bore symbols, twists and turns of lines and shapes, almost like tattoos, but with a strange, organic quality to them, as though the markings were alive. Then, without any kind of announcement or fanfare, the ceremony began. A figure stepped forward from the crowd, a tall man, his face hidden behind a mask made of rough leather, weathered with age. He held something in his hands, something wrapped in cloth. Slowly, he unwrapped it, revealing a long, jagged knife. John's breath caught in his throat. The crowd went completely still, their eyes fixed on the man. The air felt like it was holding its breath. And then, the first hand was offered. John's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the man with the knife approach the first villager, a middle-aged woman standing near the front of the circle. She stood motionless, her face blank, almost serene, as the man raised the blade. A collective hush fell over the crowd. The woman extended her arm slowly, her hand outstretched. John squinted to get a better look at her hand, where the markings swirled and curved like an ancient script. She didn't seem afraid, only resigned, as the man placed the blade at the base of her wrist. Without hesitation, he cut. The blade sliced through her skin with a clean, almost surgical precision. Blood poured from the wound, but the woman didn't cry out. Her eyes remained unfocused, and she simply stood there, accepting the offering. The man took her severed hand and placed it onto the altar. The crowd remained silent, watching as the woman's stump began to bleed profusely, the flow of blood strangely steady. John's stomach twisted. He wanted to look away, but couldn't. It was like witnessing something too horrifying to process, yet impossible to ignore. After a moment, the woman stepped back, and another villager stepped forward, a young man this time. The ritual continued in the same silent, terrifying manner. Each person who offered their hand did so, with no sign of fear or pain. It was as if they had done this before, and had accepted it as part of their way of life. John's head spun. What kind of ritual was this? A sacrifice? A tradition? He wasn't sure, but he knew that he had to find out more. The chilling image of those bloodied hands stayed in his mind, gnawing at him, making him question what was happening here. He moved closer, trying to stay inconspicuous, but as he did, he felt the gaze of someone on him. He turned, meeting the eyes of a villager, a man who appeared to be in his late 30s. The man's expression was unreadable, his face covered in a mask much like the others, though this one was adorned with strange symbols carved into the wood. His gaze pierced through the mask, as if trying to see right into John's soul. John quickly looked away, feeling a strange unease wash over him. It was as though the man knew exactly what he was thinking, like his curiosity had become a threat. The ritual continued until everyone had offered their hand, each sacrifice placed onto the altar in a neat, bloody pile. The air was thick with the smell of iron and earth, and John's stomach churned as he watched the last of the hands being offered. The man who had been performing the ritual, the one with the knife, stepped back, and the crowd slowly began to disperse. The energy in the square felt heavy, almost oppressive, and John couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from shadows. He turned and walked quickly back to the inn, his heart still racing. The door of the inn creaked as he entered, and the warmth of the fire did little to ease the cold sensation creeping over him. He was alone, for now, but the images of the festival, the hands, the blood, those would haunt him for the rest of the night. Elder Marla was behind the counter, watching him with a knowing look in her eyes. He said nothing, but simply gestured toward the stairs. John nodded in silent acknowledgement and made his way up to his room. As he closed the door behind him, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. There, lying on the floor beside his bed, was a small wooden figure. It was crudely carved and abstract, representation of a human figure with no hands. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, noticing the same strange symbols etched into its surface, the same markings he had seen on the villager's hands. He placed the figure down on the nightstand, his mind racing with questions. Was this some kind of omen? A warning? What was the meaning behind the ritual? And why had he been left this figure? The fire crackled softly, but the warmth didn't reach him. He felt a growing sense of dread, something he couldn't quite explain, but that was unmistakable. That night, John locked the door and sat in the corner of the room, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. He couldn't sleep. There was too much to process, too many things that didn't make sense. And with each passing hour, he felt more and more like he was in over his head. But he had come this far, and he was determined to uncover the truth. The night dragged on in a strange, oppressive silence. John sat by the window, staring out at the darkened village square, his mind buzzing with questions that he couldn't answer. He had to figure out what was going on here, but something told him that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous it would become. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. He could still hear the faint sound of distant murmurs coming from outside, the villagers talking in hushed tones as they went about their business. It felt like the entire village was on edge, like something was about to happen, and no one was willing to speak about it. John finally couldn't take the tension anymore. He stood up and walked to the door, intent on going back to the square, hoping to find someone who could answer his questions. But as he reached for the door handle, a soft knock interrupted him. He froze. Another knock, this time louder. The sound of it was deliberate, almost too deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side was waiting for him to answer. John's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at the wooden figure on the nightstand. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare at him more intensely now, its presence unsettling in the quiet room. He opened the door cautiously. Standing there in the hallway was Elder Marla, her face shadowed by the dim light from the hallway lantern. Her expression was unreadable, and her eyes held a deep, knowing sorrow. "You shouldn't be out here," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange weight. "It's dangerous to go wandering after the festival." John swallowed hard, tried to muster up the courage to ask her what he had been wondering all night. "What's going on here, Marla? What is this festival really about?" Her gaze shifted briefly to the figure on the nightstand, and John noticed her lips tighten for just a moment. She took a step into the room, her presence somehow commanding the space. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low. "The offering." John nodded, still feeling the weight of the blood, and the severed hands lingering in his mind. Yes, but I don't understand. Why? Why do they do it? Marla sighed, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of some ancient truth was pressing on her. The village has been bound by a pact made long before my time, long before any of us knew the price. She paused, her gaze becoming distant, as though she were seeing something beyond the walls of the room. Every year, we must give an offering to the entity beneath the earth. It feeds on the blood, on the sacrifice, and in return, it protects us, keeps the village safe from disease, from famine, from the things that lurk in the dark. John felt a chill creep up his spine. The entity? What is it? Her eyes flickered with something almost like fear before she answered. It is old, older than the village itself. It lives beneath us in the mountain. It demands its tribute, and if we do not offer it, the village will fall. That is the way of things. John felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. This can't be real. You're talking about some kind of monster. Elder Marla's gaze softened, and she took a step closer, her voice almost a whisper. You think it's a monster? No, John. It's worse than that. It is not a creature you can fight or escape. It is a presence, an ancient force that controls everything. The village survives only by feeding it. And if we stop, if we fail. She trailed off, and John could see her hands tremble ever so slightly. Then what happens? The village will be consumed. It will crumble, and the entity will claim everyone, every last soul here, as its own. John's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to process everything. He had come here seeking adventure, a story to write. But now, he realized he had walked into something far beyond anything he had ever imagined. A real, living nightmare. He turned to her. Why didn't you stop this? Why didn't you tell anyone? Marla shook her head. Some truths are not ours to control. The pact was made long ago, and we are bound to it. There are no choices here, only the offerings. John's pulse quickened. He was beginning to feel like a part of the ritual itself, trapped within the village's dark cycle. No longer just an outsider, but a participant. Before he could speak again, a loud, echoing sound came from the direction of the square. The villagers were gathering again. Their footsteps were heavier now, more deliberate. Marla's eyes hardened. It's time, she said grimly. The last offering, the one that will decide whether the village survives another year or becomes the next sacrifice. John could feel his stomach churn. The terror was real. The ritual wasn't over. Marla turned to leave, but stopped halfway through the door. I suggest you stay inside, John. If you know what's good for you, don't try to stop this. But John couldn't just sit idly by. His curiosity, his need to understand what he had witnessed, overpowered his fear. He had to see this through. John hurriedly grabbed his coat and stepped into the darkened hallway, moving quietly toward the stairs. He could feel the vibrations in the air, the tense energy of the village waiting for something, for the final sacrifice. Something deep in his gut told him that tonight would be different. Tonight, something would go wrong. As he approached the door, the hairs on his neck stood on end. He knew he wasn't just a visitor anymore. Whatever happened next, he would be part of it, whether he wanted to or not. The door opened with a soft creak, and John stepped back into the square, his eyes immediately drawn to the altar in the center. And then he saw it. Atop the altar lay the final hand, his own. John's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. There, on the altar, was his own hand, crimson with blood, resting among the severed ones from the ritual earlier. He blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the sight didn't change. It was still there. Panic rose in his chest, and his pulse quickened. He stumbled back, his legs nearly giving out beneath him, but he caught himself on the cold stone of a nearby building. His thoughts spiraled. How? Why? He hadn't even offered anything. He hadn't done anything to deserve this. A low, haunting chant filled the air, pulling him back to reality. He turned. and his breath caught in his throat as he saw the villagers gathered in a tight circle around the altar. They stood perfectly still, faces expressionless, each of them holding a lantern that flickered in the night wind. The chanting was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, as they raised their hands toward the altar. The masked figure with the knife, no longer the man from the earlier ritual, but someone taller, older, and more imposing, stepped forward. His eyes shone darkly through the carved-eye holes of his mask, staring directly at John. "You are late." The figure's voice was low and gravelly, like a whisper from the deep earth itself. John couldn't move. His body was frozen with fear, and his throat was tight, unable to form any words. The figure reached down, grasping the severed hand that lay on the altar, and lifted it into the air. "Your offering has been accepted," the figure intoned, his voice resonating with a strange, otherworldly power. "The pact is complete." John could feel his knees shake beneath him as the villagers continued their chant, their voices rising in volume and intensity. The ground beneath him seemed to vibrate, as though the very earth was alive and aware of what was happening. He forced himself to speak, though his voice cracked with fear. I didn't offer anything. I didn't agree to any pact." The figure's head tilted slightly, and for a moment, John thought he saw the faintest smile beneath the mask. The figure stepped closer to him, holding the bloody hand in front of his face. "You don't need to agree, traveler," the figure said. "The pact was made for you long before you arrived. It knew you would come, and now you will be part of it, as all outsiders are." John's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of his impending fate pressing down on him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the bloodstained hand. He looked at the villagers, each of them eerily calm, as though they were all bound by an invisible chain. He could see the same symbols on their hands that had been on the wooden figure in his room. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. The entity beneath the earth. It wasn't just some ancient god. It was something much older, something that could see the threads of fate before they were even spun. It had seen him, and now it had claimed him. Before he could take another breath, a sharp pain sliced through his wrist. The figure's blade had struck him with a swift, practiced motion, carving deep into his flesh. The crowd's chanting intensified, growing louder, more frenzied, as the blood poured from his wound and dripped onto the altar. John's vision blurred. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the eerie, haunting chants of the villagers. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, the world spinning around him. The figure stood over him, looking down with a sense of finality. The offering is made. The entity is satisfied. The cycle continues. John's vision began to fade, but just before everything went dark, he thought he saw something moving beneath the ground, as though the earth itself was shifting, awakening, reaching for him. When John awoke, it was as though he had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. His body ached, and his wrist throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. He was back in his room at the inn, lying on the floor. The fire was low, casting only faint embers in the hearth. The wooden figure was still on the nightstand, but now it was no longer empty. Two hands, severed, bloodied, and marked with the same strange symbols as the villagers, rested beside it. One of them was his own. John's breath hitched as the door to his room creaked open. Elder Marla stood there, her expression unreadable. "It is done," she said softly, her voice carrying a heaviness that seemed to pull at the very air around them. "You've joined the village, John. There's no going back. You will stay here with us now, bound by the pact." John wanted to scream, to run, but his body felt heavy, sluggish. The pain in his wrist pulsed with every beat of his heart. I can't," he managed to say, his voice weak and trembling. Elder Marla stepped forward, her eyes gentle yet filled with sorrow. "It's not a choice, child. The entity has claimed you. The cycle is complete, and now you're one of us. Forever." John looked at his hand, now marked with the same symbols as the villagers, the same markings he had seen on the altar. He felt the cold grip of despair wrap around him, realizing there was no escape. the village, the pact, the entity, it was all inescapable. As he lay there, consumed by the weight of his fate, the faint sound of chanting reached his ears from the village square. It would never stop. The pact would continue. The entity would always demand its offering. And John was now a part of it, bound to the village and its ancient, terrifying truth. John's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of panic. He could feel the weight of the symbols carved into his skin, the same marks that had covered the villagers' hands, and now they were his too. The sense of helplessness wrapped around him like a shroud, pressing the air from his lungs. Elder Marla stood over him, watching with the same sorrowful, knowing gaze. "There is no escaping it, John," she said softly, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The entity is ancient, and its will is unyielding. You become part of something much bigger than yourself." John tried to sit up, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish, his body refusing to obey. The blood from his wound was drying, but the pain still throbbed in his wrist. He glanced at the blood-stained figure on a nightstand again, its hollow eyes seemingly mocking him now. It had always known, hadn't it? It had known that he would be part of this cycle. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be happening. I'm not one of you. I'm not a part of this." But as he spoke, something inside him felt different, a gnawing, twisting sensation deep within his chest, like the pull of something dark and ancient. The symbols on his wrist began to burn, faint but unmistakable. He could feel their presence inside him, reaching through his veins, coursing through his blood, as if the pact was already sinking its roots into him. Elder Marla watched him for a long moment, her eyes not filled with cruelty, but something deeper, pity, perhaps, or an acceptance of a fate that no one could change. "Fighting it will only bring you pain, John," she said, her voice low. "You can try to resist, but you will only make it worse. The entity doesn't care for defiance. It feeds on submission, on acceptance." John's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. He had seen the ritual. He had felt the presence of something darker, something beyond understanding. The ground had trembled beneath him. The entity, it had been there, watching, waiting. It had claimed him, chosen him, and now he was bound to it. But there had to be a way out, right? There had to be something he could do. Suddenly, a thought pierced through his haze of despair. He remembered the figure, the wooden figure with the markings. The same symbols etched into the villager's hands, and now his own. Could it be a key? He felt a sudden impulse to act. With all the strength he could muster, he grabbed the figure from the nightstand and held it in his hand. His fingers tightened around it, as if trying to squeeze the answers out of the carved wood. The symbols on the figure seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the room, and for a brief moment, John could swear he heard whispers, soft like voices on the wind, murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. Marla watched him closely, her expression unreadable. She stepped closer, her voice soft but laced with a quiet finality. "The entity knows your thoughts, John. It knows your fear, and the more you try to escape, the more it will pull you under." John looked up at her, eyes burning with determination. "I can't accept this. I won't." The fire crackled low in the hearth, and a cold breeze blew in through the cracks in the window. The room seemed to grow darker, the air thick with an oppressive presence. John's fingers tightened around the figure once more, and for the first time, he felt the power in it. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a vessel, a link to whatever force had been controlling the village for generations. If the village had been offering sacrifices for so long, there had to be a way to break the cycle. There had to be a way to undo what had been done. But then, as if in response to his thoughts, a sudden, intense pressure washed over him. His head swam, his vision blurring, and a sharp, stabbing pain surged through his chest. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against him from all sides. The whispers grew louder, no longer faint murmurs, but an overwhelming chorus of voices, ancient, cold, and full of hunger. The air was alive with their presence, swirling around him. His breath quickened, and his heart raced as the whispers began to form words in a language he could understand. Give in. Accept your fate. Join us. John gasped, dropping the figure as the pain intensified. He could feel something tugging at his soul, pulling him toward the entity, binding him to it with invisible chains. The marks on his wrist burned like fire, and the darkness around him seemed to grow, swallowing the light from the room. Elder Marla's voice cut through the chaos, her tone calm, almost mournful. It is no use, John. You cannot fight what is older than time itself. The pact will not be broken. His body shook as he tried to resist, as he fought against the pull that was dragging him into the abyss. His mind screamed for freedom, for an end to this nightmare. But then, in that moment of agony, something deep within him responded. A single, defiant thought surged through him like a wave. I will not be consumed. He clutched his wrist, the burning marks searing his skin, but the pain was no longer enough to break his resolve. He didn't know how or why, but he felt something shift within him, a surge of energy, a flicker of resistance, as if the pact itself was weakening just a little. No, he muttered, his voice hoarse. I won't be part of this. I won't join you. The room seemed to freeze, the whispers suddenly ceasing. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, with a deafening crash, the door to the room slammed open. The door slammed open with such force that it nearly flew off its hinges, sending a gust of cold air into the room. John's heart pounded in his chest, and his entire body went rigid as the silence shattered. Standing in the doorway was a tall figure, taller than any villager, cloaked in dark robes, with a face hidden beneath a hood. The figure's presence seemed to ripple through the air, a dark aura that made the very walls feel like they were closing in. The figure didn't step forward. It simply stood there, its presence enough to make the room feel smaller, darker. Elder Marla froze, her face paling as she turned toward the new arrival. Her usual calm demeanor faltered, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossing her features. The elder, the figure's voice was low, smooth, and resonated like the deepest parts of the earth itself. It was neither male nor female, but something in between, a voice that had carried across centuries of silence. Has failed in her duty. John's heart skipped. Failed in her duty? What did that mean? Elder Marla's eyes widened, but she remained silent, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She lowered her gaze, and for the first time, John saw true fear in her eyes. The figure stepped into the room, and the very air seemed to shift around it, vibrating with power. As it did, John's vision blurred again, but this time he didn't feel the same crushing weight as before. Instead, he felt something else, a presence within him, pushing back against the entity, pushing back against the pull of the pact. The figure's arrival seemed to disrupt the connection, if only for a moment. John's grip tightened on his wrist, the pain still burning through him, but now there was a strange clarity in his mind. He could hear the whispers again, but this time they were different. They weren't the dark, commanding voices of the entity. They were desperate. Don't fight us. You belong to us now. You are ours. But John shook his head, his breath ragged. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this entity win. Not now, not after everything. He didn't know exactly what the rogue figure was, but if it had the power to interrupt the ritual, perhaps it was his only chance. The robed figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly through the hood, an unnatural, eerie light. It turned toward him, and the pressure in the room intensified. You are foolish, human, the figure intoned, its voice echoing through the air. You cannot resist what is inevitable. The pact is centuries old, stronger than your will, your hopes. You will join us, whether you like it or not. John could feel the overwhelming presence of the entity beneath the earth, its force pulling at him like gravity. It wanted him. It needed him. But for the first time, he refused to let it. With a surge of adrenaline, John reached out and grabbed the figure. No, not the figure, the staff that it was holding. The staff had been hidden under the robes, and now, as his hand made contact with it, a shock of cold energy rushed through him. His fingers burned as they touched the ancient wood, but then something incredible happened. The symbol on his wrist flared in response, pulsing with light. The whispers grew louder, but now they weren't just calling him, they were screaming in anguish. He could hear them, feel them trying to claw their way out from beneath the earth. No! Stop! The figure's hands twitched as though it were struggling to retain control. The energy from the staff was surging through John, and he realized this wasn't just any staff. This was an object of power, something that could break the entity's hold on the village. The figure recoiled slightly, its dark aura faltering for the first time. You have no idea what you are doing. The figure hissed, its voice turning to a growl. You cannot unbind what has been woven into the very fabric of existence. John's mind was racing, but his body was moving on its own, the staff now crackling with an energy he couldn't explain. There was a sense of rightness, as though this was the final piece he needed to unlock the secret of the village's curse. He had come here seeking a story, and instead, he had found something far more sinister, a village enslaved by an ancient pact. But now he was going to end it. With a cry of defiance, John raised the staff high, pointing it directly at the rogue figure. "I will not join you," he shouted, his voice filled with the power he felt surging within him. The staff's glow intensified, the symbols on his wrist flaring brightly. A beam of white-hot light shot out from the staff and collided with the rogue figure. The force of it sent a shock wave through the room, knocking John off his feet and sending the figure stumbling back, its robes swirling as if caught in an invisible storm. The figure screeched, a sound that was not entirely human, before its form began to unravel, like smoke dissolving in the wind. For a moment, the air seemed to hang in silence, as though the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. And then, with a final crack, the figure vanished, leaving only the faintest echo of its presence behind. John lay on the floor, breathless, heart pounding, and his body trembling from the exertion. The whispers were gone, silent now, as if the entity had retreated back beneath the earth. The air felt different, lighter. The weight of the pact had lifted, at least for now. Elder Marla stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. You've broken the pact." John struggled to sit up, pain still thrumming in his wrist, but not nearly as overwhelming as before. I had no choice. A long pause passed, the two of them locked in a silent standoff. Finally, Marla spoke again, her voice softer but still laced with caution. "The entity, it will be furious. It will want revenge." John nodded slowly, knowing the battle wasn't over. But for the first time since arriving in the village, he didn't feel entirely helpless. He had broken the chains, and for now, the cycle had been stopped. But the entity was still out there, and it would want to reclaim what it had lost. John's body still ached from the release of energy, his muscles weak and trembling, but he pushed himself to his feet. The room around him felt strangely still, the silence deafening in its wake. The air, once heavy with dark whispers, now felt almost normal again, but it was a fragile normalcy. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, thick with the knowledge that the entity had been driven back for now. Elder Marla stood across from him, her hands clasped together as though she were bracing herself for something. Her face was pale, drained of color, and her usual air of control was gone. "You don't understand what you've done," she said softly, her voice tinged with fear, her gaze shifting nervously to the place where the figure had vanished. "The entity will not forgive this. You've broken the balance. The pact has been its cornerstone for generations." John's breath was ragged, but his resolve was solid. "I don't care about the balance. This village has been bound by a curse for centuries. People have died. And for what? To feed an entity that lives beneath the earth." Marla's eyes softened for a brief moment, almost as if she understood the weight of what he was saying. But then the look disappeared, replaced by something darker, something colder. "You think the village would survive without it?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost sad. "Without the entity's protection, the land would wither. The crops would fail. The animals would starve. The village itself would be swallowed up by the earth. We gave it what it wanted, offering the blood of those who came to us, the outsiders who had no place in the world. And in return, it kept us safe. It gave us prosperity." John shook his head, anger and disbelief bubbling inside him. "That's no excuse. You're sacrificing people for your own comfort." Marla's lips twisted into a tight line, as though she were considering something deeply. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand on the wooden figure still lying on the floor. The markings on it still glowed faintly in the dim light. "Do you understand what this is?" she asked, her voice barely audible, almost as though speaking to herself. "This isn't just a ritual. It's the foundation of our lives. It's a contract we've honored for generations. We had no choice. Without it, we would have perished." John stared at her, his mind reeling. He couldn't fathom the depth of her words, the idea that the villagers had been relying on this horror, this pact, for their survival. It was as though they had traded one form of hell for another, each generation living in the shadow of the entity, feeding it their blood, offering up the souls of the unsuspecting. "You had a choice," he said, his voice hard, his chest rising with the weight of his anger. "You could have chosen freedom. You could have stopped it." Marla's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she almost seemed like a different person, one who was hardened by years of carrying a burden too heavy for most to bear. She turned toward him, her gaze unwavering. "Do you really think it was that simple? That we could just turn away from something so powerful, something that has been with us for so long?" Her voice quivered, but it wasn't fear, it was resignation. "You think you've ended it, but the entity's power isn't so easily destroyed. It's not gone, it's merely waiting." John's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly felt the air grow heavier again, the silence pressing down on him. For all he had just done, had he really accomplished anything? Or had he just disrupted something he didn't fully understand? "Then what do we do?" John asked, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. "We can't let it take any more lives." Marla didn't respond immediately. Her eyes turned to the altar where the blood had dried and the symbols still glimmered faintly. Her fingers trembled as she reached out and brushed the tips of her fingers across the ancient carvings. "Perhaps you haven't broken the pact entirely, John," she murmured. "Perhaps there's another way." John's brow furrowed. "Another way?" Her gaze flicked back to him, dark and somber. The entity feeds not just on sacrifice. It feeds on fear, on the will to survive. As long as there is fear, it will remain. The village has been feeding that fear for generations, and now it is too deep within the roots of the land. But she paused, her voice lowering. Maybe there's a way to challenge it directly. To break this cycle. John's breath quickened. Ow! Marla stood still for a moment, as if lost in thought. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, yet edged with a kind of grim determination. "There's an ancient temple deep in the forest. outside of the village. It is said to hold the key to the entity's power, a place where the first pact was made. If we can find it, and if we can destroy it, destroy whatever is binding the entity to this land, then the curse will break. John's pulse quickened. It sounded like a long shot, like something out of legend or myth, but if there was even a chance, it was one they had to take. "But why haven't you done this before?" he asked. "Why wait until now?" Her eyes clouded with a deep sadness. "Because every time we tried, the entity knew. It would send its agents, and those who ventured too close would vanish. The pact is alive. It has a will of its own, and it will not let us sever its hold so easily. But now, you've done something the entity did not anticipate." John took a deep breath, his mind racing. He wasn't sure if he fully believed in the possibility of this temple, or whether Marla was just grasping at straws to fix a problem she had lived with for so long. But one thing was certain. The entity hadn't just disappeared, and the village was still in danger. "Let's do it," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll find this temple. We'll end the pact once and for all." Marla nodded slowly. "It will be dangerous, but if you are willing, so am I." John's hand went to his wrist, feeling the faint burn of the marks. He couldn't ignore the sense of urgency, the feeling that time was running out. Together, they would face whatever came next, whatever this temple might hold, and they would end the pact once and for all. The price was too high, and the village could no longer live in its shadow. But as they prepared to leave the room, a soft rumble beneath their feet made them both pause. The ground seemed to tremble almost imperceptibly. It was as if the entity, feeling its power wane, had sensed the shift in the air, and it was already coming for them. The ground beneath their feet shuddered again, this time more pronounced, as if something deep below the earth had stirred. The air thickened with an oppressive weight, and John could feel it, the entity's presence, clawing at the edges of his mind. It was aware of them, aware of their plan. The moment they had made their decision to defy it, the entity was no longer playing games. John turned to Marla, his eyes burning with determination. "We need to move fast," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We don't have much time." Marla nodded solemnly. She moved quickly, grabbing the staff from the floor where it had been discarded and handing it to him. "This is our only hope, but you must be ready, John. What we're about to face is not just the entity, it's everything that has been built into this land, this village, over centuries. The temple is its heart. If we destroy it, we sever the entity's grip, but the battle won't be easy." John gripped the staff tightly, its weight grounding him. The air felt thick with the tension of what was to come. He felt the burn in his wrist again. The marks were alive, a constant reminder of the pact that had tried to claim him, the entity that still wanted him. They moved quickly, exiting the cabin and stepping into the cold night. The village was eerily quiet, as though the very earth was holding its breath. John couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The forest loomed ahead, dark and dense. It felt like it was swallowing them as they entered, the trees closing in around them, their branches creaking like skeletal fingers. The air was damp, filled with the smell of moss and decay. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching through the underbrush. John's thoughts raced as they trudged deeper into the forest. Was this really the only way? Were they just walking into the heart of the darkness, where the entity's power was strongest? He didn't know, but he had no choice. They had to try. After what felt like hours, they came upon a clearing, a small, hidden valley that seemed untouched by time. In the center of it stood a large stone structure, its jagged edges rising from the earth like the teeth of a great beast. The air was colder here, the ground frozen underfoot. And there, at the base of the structure, were symbols, ancient, twisted, and glowing faintly in the dark. "This is it," Marla whispered, her voice trembling. "The temple." John felt a shiver run through him as he stared at the structure. The symbols on the stone were unmistakable, and they mirrored the markings on his wrist. He reached up and touched his skin instinctively, as though the symbols might react to the ancient power around them. Marla stood beside him, looking up at the temple with a mixture of awe and dread. This place, it's older than the village itself, older than anything we know. They approached cautiously, the weight of the temple's energy pressing down on them. As they drew closer, the temperature dropped, and John could hear faint whispers in the wind, the same whispers that had tormented him before. But this time, they were different, more insistent, more desperate. Leave. Go back. You cannot win. You are ours. John clenched his jaw, pushing the fear down. We're not turning back, he muttered to himself, louder than the voices in his head. Not now. Marla stepped forward, holding her hand up to the stone surface of the temple. The symbols seemed to pulse in response to her touch, almost like they were alive, resonating with the power of the entity. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. We need to destroy the heart of the temple, she said, opening her eyes again, her voice steady despite the fear in her gaze. There's an altar at the center. That's where the original pact was sealed. If we destroy it, we destroy the entity's power here. But we must hurry. The moment we activate it, the entity will know. John nodded, his grip tightening on the staff. Let's do it. They moved toward the center of the temple, the whispers growing louder with every step. The air was thick with an unnatural pressure, as though the very ground was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The altar was at the heart of the temple, a massive stone structure that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. The symbols on it matched the ones on John's wrist, on the figure, and on the villagers. It was the source of the entity's power. This was where everything had begun. John felt the pull again, that force trying to drag him into the entity's embrace, but he fought it, standing firm. The staff in his hand glowed faintly in response, as though it was connected to the altar. The moment he stepped forward, the ground trembled, and a low growl rumbled from the walls of the temple. We have to break the altar, Marla said, urgency creeping into her voice. There's no time. You have to strike it with the staff. John raised the staff high, his heart pounding. The whispers in the air were deafening now, almost as if the entity was screaming at him, begging him to stop. No, not again. You cannot defy us. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. With a final, desperate cry, he swung the staff down onto the altar, and the moment it made contact, there was a blinding flash of light. The entire temple seemed to shake, the ground splitting beneath them, the walls cracking and splintering. A roar, inhuman, monstrous, echoed through the air, shaking John to his core. The ground beneath him quaked violently, as though the very earth was about to swallow him whole. For a moment, everything went black. When John opened his eyes again, the world around him had changed. The temple was gone, reduced to rubble. The ground had stopped shaking, and the air felt lighter, freer. The oppressive weight that had haunted the village, the entity, seemed to have lifted. John looked over at Marla, who was still standing beside him, her face pale, but alive with something else now. Relief, perhaps, or hope. We did it, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. It's over. John's heart raced, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The entity's grip on the village had been severed, and the pact was no more. He had faced the darkness, defied it, and somehow survived. But deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The world was changing, and the echoes of what they had done might ripple out farther than they could imagine. As he turned to leave the wreckage of the temple behind, a distant thought tugged at the back of his mind. The entity was not gone. It had only been driven back. And while the village might be free, There would always be a part of him that would wonder if the darkness was truly gone, or if it was merely waiting for the next person to cross its path. The ground trembled again, this time with more force, as if the very earth itself was reacting to their decision. A deep, low rumble echoed from beneath, like the growl of a distant beast stirring from its long slumber. John and Marla exchanged a quick, nervous glance, knowing that whatever they were about to face would be far beyond anything they had encountered so far. "This is it," Marla whispered, more to herself than to John. "The entity knows. It won't let us leave without a fight." John felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. They were running out of time. If the entity was already aware of their plan, they couldn't waste another moment. The only way to stop the cycle, to free the village, was to reach the temple and destroy whatever was anchoring the entity to the land. Marla gathered her robes around her and moved toward the door, her movements stiff and deliberate. John followed, his pulse quickening with each step. The air in the room was thick, charged with the weight of impending doom, but there was no turning back now. As they exited the house, the village around them looked strangely quiet, as though the usual hum of life had stilled in the wake of their actions. The sky overhead had darkened, clouds swirling with an unnatural heaviness. The tension was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Marla didn't hesitate. She led the way through the village, her eyes scanning the empty streets with a wariness that John shared. They walked in silence, but John could feel the weight of the symbols on his wrist, burning faintly with every step. He still didn't fully understand the force that had taken hold of him, but he knew one thing. The entity was still out there, still waiting. The path leading into the forest was overgrown, the trees dense and ancient, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy above. The air was thick with moisture, and every breath John took felt heavier than the last. The forest was eerily silent, as though it, too, was holding its breath, waiting for something. Marla stopped abruptly in front of a large, gnarled tree with roots that twisted like serpents across the forest floor. "It was here," she said. The temple was hidden beneath the roots, concealed in the depths of the earth. "The temple isn't far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's protected. The entity has placed its wards here, and they will not let us pass easily." John's heart raced. He could already feel it, the oppressive weight of something ancient pressing down on them, something that was alive. The earth beneath his feet seemed to shift, subtly at first, then more violently. And then he saw it, faint at first, just a shimmer in the air, but growing clearer with each second. A dark, twisting shape, a shadow that seemed to move on its own, as though the very forest was coming alive to stop them. Marla raised her hand in front of her, chanting softly in a language John didn't understand. The symbols on her skin, the same ones that had marked the villagers, seemed to glow faintly. The shadowy figure writhed, its form becoming clearer, a grotesque amalgamation of shapes and faces, twisting in agony. It was the entity's first line of defense, a manifestation of its will, a physical barrier to keep intruders away. And it was coming for them. John's heart pounded as he stepped back instinctively, but Marla's voice remained calm, focused. "We need to move quickly," she said, her eyes narrowing as she lifted her hand higher, the symbols on her skin flaring with a new intensity. "The entity is desperate to stop us." With a sudden surge of energy, Marla thrust her hand forward, and a burst of light shot from her fingertips, striking the shadowy figure. It recoiled, the form flickering like an illusion, but it wasn't gone. It was simply waiting, swirling like smoke, and it was drawing closer. John could feel the pull, the weight of the entity's presence growing stronger. It was as though the forest itself was alive with the entity's power, and the deeper they went, the stronger that pull became. Marla didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, pulling John forward. "We have to reach the heart of the temple," The power source is there. If we can destroy it, we can sever the connection. But we have to hurry. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the temperature seemed to drop, and the shadows grew longer, stretching across the ground like dark fingers. The air thickened with each step, the weight of the entity's malevolent force pressing down harder and harder. John could hear the whispers again, distant at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Turn back. You cannot win. You will join us. The voice was everywhere, filling his head, sinking into his thoughts. John fought it off, pressing forward, refusing to be consumed by the fear it was trying to plant within him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the center of the forest, where the roots of the trees formed a massive web, crisscrossing in every direction. In the center of the web, half buried in the earth, stood an ancient stone structure, its surface covered in symbols that matched the ones on John's wrist. This was it, the temple. The ground around it was cracked, as though the weight of something immense was pressing down on it from below. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. The entity was close. "This is it," Marla said, her voice trembling slightly. "The heart of the pact. The temple's core holds the entity's anchor. If we destroy it, the entity will be weakened. But we must act quickly." John nodded, his breath ragged, his mind focused on the task ahead. The whispers were overwhelming now, the force of the entity pushing against him. His wrist burned, and the markings on his skin seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispers. Marla reached out, placing her hand on the stone, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The symbols on the stone lit up, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Then, with a sharp crack, a massive root shot out of the ground, blocking their path. "Get ready," Marla shouted. "The entity is sending everything it has." The ground beneath them began to shift violently as the temple itself began to awaken. Roots and vines erupted from the earth, twisting and reaching out like massive, living hands. The entity was fighting back, desperately trying to keep them from destroying its source of power. John's hand tightened around the staff, feeling its power surge once more. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. "Now," he shouted. Together, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever the entity threw at them. This was the final confrontation. They had to destroy the heart of the pact, or the cycle would never end. The earth beneath their feet trembled violently as the roots of the temple surged upward, twisting into massive, grotesque shapes. The air was thick with the oppressive energy of the entity, and the whispers became deafening, as though the very earth itself was alive with its malevolent will. John gripped the staff tightly, feeling its power surge in response to the entity's fury. Marla, her face drawn and pale, moved to his side, her hands trembling as she chanted under her breath, summoning the last of her strength to counter the enemy's assault. On the charged with an almost unbearable pressure. Suddenly, the ground split open, and from the chasm that formed, a massive, shadowy figure rose. It was the entity, its form dark and shifting, a mass of writhing shadows and twisted limbs. It loomed over them, its eyes burning like coals, its mouth opening in a silent scream, as if the very act of defying it caused it pain. "You cannot escape." The entity's voice echoed in their minds, dark and low, like the rumble of thunder. "You will serve me, as all before you have." John's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood firm, refusing to let fear take root. He was done running. The village was done running. This nightmare would end here, in this forest, at the heart of the temple. "We won't serve you," he spat, his voice trembling with defiance. "You have taken enough. This ends now." Marla stepped forward, her eyes locked on the entity, her voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. "We know your power," she said, "but you are bound to this place, bound by the pact. We will destroy the heart of your anger. The entity's form writhed in fury, its shadowy tendrils reaching for them like hands made of darkness. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the entity's anger reached its peak. You think you can destroy me? It hissed. I'm beyond this temple, beyond this land. You cannot sever me. John's wrist burned again, the marks on his skin glowing in response to the entity's words. His pulse quickened, the power of the staff rising within him. It's not just the temple, he realized. The pact, the anchor, it's in me too. The entity's connection to the land, to the village, to the pact, was also tied to him. The markings on his skin, the blood that had been spilled, the sacrifices, it all came from the same source. We can, John said, his voice low but filled with conviction. The heart of your power isn't just here. It's in the blood, in the pact. It's in all of us. With a surge of energy, John raised the staff high, its tip crackling with raw power. The air around them rippled, as if reality itself was bending in response to the force they were about to unleash. The whispers grew louder, shrieking in fury as the entity tried to regain control. Marla's hands glowed as she reached out toward the altar at the center of the temple, her words falling into an ancient chant, her voice carrying a finality that filled the space between them. The roots and vines that had been attacking them hesitated, almost as though they were unsure whether to strike or retreat. The energy of the temple was fighting to protect its anchor, but something was changing, something had shifted, and the entity knew it. John's chest burned as he poured every ounce of his will into the staff. The markings on his wrist flared with light, and for a moment, the ground beneath them seemed to buckle. A deep rumbling came from the heart of the earth, the source of the entity's power shaking violently as though it were being ripped apart. The entity screamed, its voice echoing through their minds like 1,000 wails of pain and rage. The shadows surrounding them writhed, and the massive form of the entity twisted and distorted, its eyes flickering with desperation. The temple's walls began to crack, the ancient stone shuddering under the force of the energy being unleashed. No, the entity cried, its voice breaking as if it were being torn apart. You cannot destroy me. I am a pact. I am eternity. But John didn't falter. He drove the staff into the ground, and with a final, earth-shattering crack, the temple erupted in a burst of light. The roots and vines that had once held the earth together splintered, and the symbols that had once glowed brightly now shattered like fragile glass, crumbling into dust. The entity let out a final, terrible scream, its form collapsing in on itself. The shadows that had been its flesh dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only silence. John fell to his knees, the staff slipping from his hand, as the world around him seemed to shift and settle. The whispers that had once filled the air faded, and the oppressive weight that had clung to the village and the land disappeared. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air was still, peaceful. Marla sank to the ground beside him, breathing heavily. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, took in the scene around them, the shattered remains of the temple, the now quiet forest. It's over, she whispered. We did it. The pact is broken. John's body was trembling from the exhaustion of the battle, but a sense of relief washed over him, mingled with a deep, almost overwhelming sadness. The village was free. The curse was lifted. But at what cost? How many lives have been lost in the years of this twisted cycle? How many innocent souls have been consumed by the darkness? He reached for Marla's hand, and she took it, her grip firm as they sat in the shattered remnants of the temple, the ruins of a broken world around them. They had ended the pact, and in doing so, they had freed the village from its chains. But the land, the people, would never forget the shadows that had once ruled them. The battle was won, but the scars would remain. The morning sun broke through the dense canopy of trees, casting long, golden rays over the remains of the temple. The silence that had followed the destruction of the entity was deep, almost unnatural, But it was a quiet unlike any John had ever known. No more whispers, no more pressing weight, just the soft rustling of the leaves and the distant chirp of birds. John and Marla sat on the cold ground, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just transpired. The temple was in ruins, its once powerful energy now reduced to dust, the last echoes of the entity swallowed by the earth. John looked around at the broken stones and shattered roots. The forest, once twisted with corruption, now seemed to breathe in a new, fragile life. But it was a life that had been hard-won. Each step forward in the village's future would be a step through the rubble of its past. "Do you think it's really over?" John asked quietly, his voice still thick with exhaustion. Marla's gaze lingered on the wreckage, her eyes shadowed with weariness. "The pact is broken. The entity is gone," she said softly, but her voice had a distant, haunted edge. "But some things, they don't disappear completely. They leave marks, scars, and they take a long time to heal." John nodded. He could feel it too, the echo of the darkness that still clung to the land, even though it had been driven back. The villagers had been freed, but the pain, the fear, and the distrust would remain long after the entity was gone. They stood slowly, helping each other to their feet. The journey back to the village felt both immediate and distant, like it was happening in another life altogether. The land around them was quieter now, as if the earth itself were holding its breath, uncertain of what would come next. As they walked, the forest slowly began to change. The oppressive weight that had once pressed down upon them lifted with each step, but the remnants of the past were impossible to ignore. The trees, though no longer twisted, seemed to carry the memories of what had been, ancient, heavy with sorrow, yet beginning to heal. When they finally emerged from the forest, the village came into view, its silhouette framed by the rising sun. There was no celebration, no shouts of joy. There was only silence, heavy, collective silence, as the people of the village watched from their windows and doorways. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before a woman stepped forward, her face pale, eyes wide with uncertainty. She was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would bring the darkness back. John nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, the entity is gone. The pact is broken." A murmur rippled through the villagers, some staring in disbelief, others with a hint of hope beginning to form in their eyes. But it was clear that the scars of the past would not disappear overnight. The village was free, but its people still carried the weight of the years spent under the shadow of the pact. Marla stepped forward, her voice quiet but strong. "We have broken the chains that bound this land, but now the real work begins. The healing will take time. We cannot undo the past, but we can rebuild." The villagers watched her closely, some with cautious optimism, others with doubt. The trust had been eroded over the years, and it would take time to regain it. But there was something in Marla's words, a truth they hadn't dared to believe until now. John turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "We did what we could. We gave him a chance to start fresh." She smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. "I hope it's enough." The days that followed were long and filled with work, both physical and emotional. The villagers began the painstaking process of rebuilding, not just their homes, but their lives. The forest that had once been a source of fear was now a place of recovery, the land slowly beginning to heal from the entity's grip. But healing was never quick, and it was never easy. John spent much of his time working with the villagers, helping them restore what was lost, while Marla worked closely with the elders and healers. The markings on his wrist were still there, though they no longer burned. They were a reminder, a link to the dark past that had tried to claim him. But he carried them now not as a burden, but as a symbol of survival, of having defied the entity and lived to see another day. One evening, as the last light of day faded behind the hills, John stood at the edge of the village, looking out over the land. The earth was beginning to recover, but the scars of the past would take a long time to fade. Marla approached silently, standing beside him without a word. They both knew that this was only the beginning, that the village had been given a second chance, but whether it could seize, it was still uncertain. They couldn't erase the past, but they could shape the future. John turned to her, his face weary but resolute. "Do you think they'll be okay?" he asked softly. Marla hesitated before answering, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, but they have a chance now. That's all we can give them." And for the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of hope, fragile, yes, but it was there. He knew that the darkness would never truly vanish completely. It would always be a part of them, a shadow lingering in the corners of their minds. But there was light now, too. It would take time, but together they could rebuild, they could heal. The village would rise from the ashes of the past, and the scars of the pact would become a distant memory, one they would carry with them as a reminder of the strength it took to overcome the darkest of forces. And perhaps, in time, the village would find its way back to the light. Weeks passed, and the village began to slowly change. The once quiet streets, which had been filled with an uneasy tension, now buzzed with a cautious energy. The people who had long been bound by the shadow of the entity began to stir with a sense of purpose. It was a fragile hope, but it was hope nonetheless. John and Marla, though physically exhausted, had not stepped away from their roles as leaders in the village's rebuilding. They both knew it would take more than just physical labor to repair the deep emotional and psychological wounds the village had endured over the years. The village had been held captive by the entity, and now they were free, but the freedom was a difficult gift to accept. One evening, as John walked along the village's edge, the stillness of the evening brought with it a peculiar sense of tranquility. The forest no longer held the oppressive, suffocating presence it once had. But something about it still felt unsettled, like the land itself was waking up from a long nightmare, stretching and groaning in its rebirth. John paused at the same spot where he had stood on the day they first returned to the village. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dirt path. The ancient trees loomed at the edge of the forest, their gnarled branches no longer twisted in the dark shapes they once had. The forest was quieter, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Marla approached quietly, her footsteps soft on the dirt. She had always been attuned to the land, the magic in its roots, its whispers. Her presence was a comfort, even if both of them carried the weight of the unknown. "You feel it too, don't you?" she asked, her voice low and thoughtful as she joined him by the forest's edge. John nodded, his gaze lingering on the trees. "There's something unsettled here still. The entity is gone, but I can't shake the feeling that it left behind something tied to this land, to the village. I'm afraid it might linger." Marla's eyes scanned the forest with a quiet intensity. "The pact is broken, but you're right. Even without the entity, the land will remember. And sometimes, the scars are deeper than we can see. The healing will take time, more than we might realize." John looked at her, his expression troubled. "You think something else might rise up, even after everything we've done?" Marla's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, but the land remembers its past. It holds on to things. Maybe not in the way we understand, but we cannot ignore the fact that we've disturbed something ancient. The entity wasn't just a presence, it was a force of nature. And now that it's gone, the land will have to adapt." John didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, processing her words. The pact had been broken, yes. The village was free, yes. But what if there were consequences they hadn't fully anticipated? As if on cue, the sound of footsteps from behind them broke the silence. They turned to find one of the villagers, an older woman named Elira, approaching, her weathered face filled with a quiet urgency. "John, Marla," she said, her voice tight with worry. "You need to come quickly." Without a word, they followed Alira toward the village. As they approached the central square, the people had gathered. It wasn't a celebration, but a silent assembly filled with concern. In the center of the village, standing beneath the twisted oak that had always been a focal point of the settlement, a strange sight caught their eyes. There, at the heart of the square, was a figure. Its shape was indistinct, barely perceptible, as if it were woven from shadows and mist. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its presence made the air feel cold, thick. The villagers stood motionless, watching, unsure what to make of the apparition. Marla's hand instinctively reached for the markings on her wrist, her face pale as she studied the figure. John felt his stomach tighten with dread as the air around them seemed to bend, as if the reality they knew was shifting once again. "What is that?" John whispered, stepping forward. Alira, her eyes wide with fear, answered in a hushed tone. "It wasn't here before. This thing, it's not one of us, and it's been watching us." John felt the hairs on his neck stand up. The shadowy figure seemed to ripple, like smoke, its form shifting with an unsettling fluidity. It wasn't the entity they had destroyed, it couldn't be. But the presence, the sensation of something ancient and malevolent, was unmistakable. Marla's voice was quiet, but steady. "It's not gone. Not completely. The entity's power, its influence, it might have left, but something else, something worse, may have remained in its place. The land is still shifting. It remembers." John stepped forward again, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" Marla didn't answer right away. Her gaze remained locked on the shadowy figure, as if trying to sense its intentions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "We need to confront it. We need to understand what this thing is, where it came from, and how we can destroy it. But we can't do it alone. The village has to come together." The villagers, who had been watching in fear and confusion, slowly began to murmur among themselves. Fear was spreading like wildfire through the crowd, but there was no time for hesitation. John and Marla had already given everything to break the cycle, but now they faced something that wasn't part of their understanding, an echo of the past, a remnant of something far more ancient than they could have imagined. John turned to Marla, his expression resolute. "We'll face it, together." With a final glance at the shadowy figure in the center of the village, John felt the weight of the decision settle upon him. The entity had been defeated, but the land was still haunted by its presence, its influence. And now, it's up to them to finish what started, no matter the cost. The villagers gathered around the square, their faces painted with a mixture of fear and uncertainty, each one drawn to the shadowy figure at the heart of the village. It was almost as if the land itself had exhaled a dark breath, summoning something ancient from deep within its soil. The figure's form remained indistinct, like a living cloud of smoke, its presence pressing down on everyone who stood nearby. John and Marla stood at the front of the group, their eyes fixed on the apparition, feeling its presence like a weight on their chest. John could hear his heart hammering in his ears, the sound of his breathing heavy in the stillness of the moment. The air was thick with tension, the villagers quiet, waiting for someone, anyone, to make the first move. Marla was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear in the quiet of the night. "This is not the entity we fought. It's something else, but its presence. It's tied to the same darkness." John nodded slowly, his hand tightening around the staff he had carried through the ordeal. The markings on his wrist flared faintly, responding to the darkness before them. The staff vibrated with a subtle hum, as if it recognized the same evil. The power that had once surged within it, the power of the pact, seemed to echo again. The shadowy figure before them twisted in the air, elongating and contracting like it was made of liquid darkness. It didn't move in the way that living beings did, more like something caught in the wind, a distortion, a thing that didn't belong. The air grew colder with each passing second, the temperature dropping sharply. "It's feeding off our fear," Marla said suddenly, as if she had read his mind. "This thing feeds on uncertainty, on the remnants of what we fought. The land remembers, but so does the evil that once ruled it." John's eyes narrowed as he studied the figure. It was still too unclear, too distant to make out any clear features, but the presence it exuded was undeniable. The shape seemed to shift, its shadowy limbs stretching, then retracting. But there was something about it that made John's stomach churn, something familiar. The whispers, once so faint, began to creep into his mind, faint at first, like a distant hum. Then it grew louder, sharp, insistent voices, all of them calling to him. His hands trembled slightly, and he clenched his fists, trying to silence the noise. The darkness was alive, clawing at the edge of his mind. Marla stepped forward, her expression fierce. "Don't listen to it. Whatever it says, it's not real. This is a trick." The voices fell silent for a brief moment, as if recognizing her resistance, but then a new voice emerged from the depths of shadow. It wasn't like the others. No, this one was different. This one spoke. "John, Marla." The voice purred a low, gravelly sound that seemed to come from every direction at once, inside their minds, outside, all around them. "Did you truly think you could break the pact? That you could sever my ties and escape?" The air seemed to thicken with the words, the shadows twisting and contracting as if the figure itself was breathing. The voice was full of power, but there was something else, a hint of mocking amusement, as if it were amused by their struggle. John's heart skipped a beat as the figure seemed to expand before them, its form drawing closer, its shape taking on more definition, but still not fully formed. "We were never the entity you destroyed," the voice continued, now ringing in their ears. "We were always here, buried beneath the earth, feeding from the same roots you destroyed. The darkness is part of this land, as much as the soil and the trees. We are the land's true heart." John gripped the staff tighter, the markings on his skin flaring with a familiar warmth. "Then why didn't you show yourself before?" he spat. "Why hide in the shadows, waiting for the right moment?" The shadowy figure shifted again, and for a brief moment, a face emerged from within its form. It was distorted, an ever-shifting mask, its features flickering like a candle flame caught in the wind. Eyes wide, hollow, and full of endless depth glared at John and Marla. And in those eyes, he saw something else. Recognition. The voice hissed again, its tone colder now, almost a laugh. "I'm no more hidden than you, John. You bear my mark, as much as the land bears mine. You all carry it. The pact lives in your blood." A chill shot through John's spine, and suddenly the truth hit him like a weight to his chest. The entity's influence, the darkness, wasn't just tied to the temple or the forest. It had been tied to the people, to the land, to the village itself. It had never been completely severed. It had only been buried, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Marla's voice broke through the heavy silence, steady but sharp. "That's what you are, isn't it? A piece of the land's soul, something born from its agony, something that was always there." The figure rippled violently, its form bending unnaturally, and the voice became a shriek in their minds. "You are nothing but vessels, vessels of the pact. The land will always remember. We will always be here." John's mind raced. They had thought the entity was the root of it all, but now they were faced with a more insidious truth. The land itself, the very fabric of the village and its people, had been shaped by the pact. The entity had only been the catalyst, the anchor. The darkness was woven into the bones of the land itself, buried beneath the earth, waiting to resurface. "What do you want?" Marla shouted, her hands glowing faintly as she prepared for another confrontation. The shadowy figure pulsed with anger, the air around it crackling with dark energy. I want what you cannot take from me. You may have destroyed the heart of my power, but my roots run deep. You cannot escape me." The figure lunged forward, a tendril of shadow, extending like a whip, aimed straight at John's chest. But just before it could strike, John raised the staff, his wrist burning with the intensity of the markings. "Then we finish this," he said through gritted teeth. With all his strength, John slammed the staff into the ground. The earth trembled beneath him, the air thick with a surge of energy as the markings on his wrist glowed brighter than ever before, matching the brilliance of the staff. The village began to vibrate, the ground groaning as if the land itself were fighting back against the shadow. The figure shrieked, a horrible, inhuman sound that reverberated through the bones of every living creature around. It lashed out, tendrils of shadow flying in every direction. But they were weaker now, faltering as the staff's power began to rise, breaking through the darkness. Marla, standing beside John, joined her voice with his, chanting in unison. Her words cut through the air like a blade. "By the blood of the land, by the fire of the pact, we sever your chains. We claim our freedom. The darkness is finished." The figure let out a final, screeching howl as the light from the staff enveloped it, the shadows dissolving, unraveling like smoke in the wind. The last remnants of its form vanished, leaving only silence in its wake. The earth stilled. The air cleared. John collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving with exertion. Marla knelt beside him, her hands trembling, but her gaze unwavering. "It's over," she whispered. The villagers slowly approached, their faces filled with awe and relief, though they, too, knew that the journey ahead would be long. The land had been scarred, deeply so, but it was free now. They were free. And as John and Marla stood, they understood one thing. The darkness would never completely fade from memory, but they had taken the first step toward healing, not just for the village, but for the very land that had once been ruled by fear. The sun rose on a new day, and though the past would always be part of them, the future was theirs to shape. The silence that followed the destruction of the shadowy figure was unlike any other John had ever experienced. It was heavy, deep, and filled with the weight of all they had endured. The earth, once trembling beneath the dark power, now felt still, as if it too were catching its breath. The villagers stood frozen for a moment, staring at the place where the figure had once been, before slowly beginning to move again, cautiously, as if not entirely sure the danger had passed. John rose to his feet, his knees weak from the strain of the confrontation, but his mind clearer now than it had been in days. The staff still hummed faintly in his hands, and the markings on his wrist had faded to a dull glow, as if the connection to the entity had finally been severed. Marla was beside him, her face drawn but resolute, her hands still crackling with energy from the spell they had unleashed. They exchanged a quiet glance, one that spoke volumes without words. "It's done," John said quietly, though his voice was hoarse, strained from the battle and the weight of everything that had happened. Marla nodded, but her expression remained somber. "Yes, but this land, it will never be the same. We may have banished the darkness for now, but the scars are deep. The village, the people, they need to heal." John looked around at the villagers. Many of them had gathered in the square, looking unsure but also relieved. Their faces, once filled with suspicion and fear, now showed the faintest glimmer of hope. But that hope was fragile, just as the land was fragile. They had been liberated from the entity's grasp, but the emotional toll of years of oppression would not fade overnight. An elder named Nira, who had always been a voice of wisdom in the village, stepped forward. She was older now, her once strong frame hunched from age, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence they had always possessed. Her gaze met John and Marla's, and she spoke in a quiet, measured voice. "You've done what no one thought possible," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "But you're right. The darkness is gone, but we have to rebuild not just our homes, but our trust in each other. The land is scarred, and so are we. John nodded, understanding. The village had been torn apart, not just by the entity, but by fear, mistrust, and years of suffering. They would have to come together, not only to rebuild their homes, but also to rebuild their lives. Marla stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "We can't erase the past," she said, her voice steady. "But we can choose what we do with the future. We have been given a chance, a rare one. A chance to heal, to build something stronger, something united. But it will take time, and it will take all of us." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what the future would hold. The road ahead would be long, and the shadows of their past would not be so easily forgotten. Yet, in Marla's words, there was a flicker of something new, something they hadn't had in years. Hope. The days that followed were filled with both physical and emotional labor. The village slowly came back to life, piece by piece. People worked together to rebuild the damaged homes and restore what had been lost. But it wasn't just the physical labor that consumed them. There were long nights spent around the fire, talking, sharing the stories of the past, confronting their fears, and beginning the slow process of healing old wounds. John spent most of his time helping where he could, but he also found himself on quiet walks through the village and the surrounding land. The forest, which had once been a place of twisted shadows, now seemed strangely peaceful, though it still bore the marks of its dark history. The trees were no longer gnarled and warped, but the earth felt heavy, as if still reeling from the darkness that had once clung to it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, John found himself standing at the edge of the forest again, looking out over the land. The village, nestled among the hills, looked almost peaceful now, its smoke rising gently from chimneys and the distant hum of voices in the air. He could feel the change in the air, the subtle shift in the earth beneath him, as if the land itself was starting to breathe again. But it was a fragile peace. He heard Marla approach behind him, her footsteps light but sure. She joined him at the edge, standing quietly beside him as they both looked out over the village. "It's strange," she said softly, "how quickly the land changes once the darkness is gone. But the memories, they linger, don't they?" John nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I keep thinking about the entity. How it was never just one thing. It was part of the land, part of us all. And now that it's gone, it's like the land has woken up, but it's still remembering. We're all still remembering." Marla's hand found his, squeezing it gently. "We can't forget what we went through, but we can decide how to move forward. We carry it with us, yes, but we don't let it define us. We don't let it consume us again." John turned to face her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He had been struggling with the weight of the past, the darkness that had shaped him, the power that had once controlled him. But standing here now, with Marla beside him and the village slowly rebuilding, he realized that maybe they could build something better, something stronger. Not because they had defeated the darkness, but because they had faced it and survived. "There's still a lot to do," he said quietly. "For all of us. The healing's just begun." Marla smiled softly. "And we'll do it together. We have time. Time to rebuild. Time to remember, but also to move forward." The air around them seemed lighter, the tension that had once gripped the village lifting ever so slowly. But there was still work to be done, both in the village and within themselves. The scars of the past would never completely fade, but with each passing day, they would find ways to heal them, to create something new in the ashes of what had been destroyed. The darkness had come, and it had been defeated, but the true challenge now was what they chose to do with the light that had followed. The days after the confrontation with the shadowy entity seemed to stretch out before the village, long and slow, but with purpose. Though the immediate danger had passed, the scars on the land and the people were deep, and recovery would take time. As the village began to rebuild its homes, its relationships, and its spirit, John and Marla found themselves turning inward, each processing the events differently. The weight of their journey still hung over them, an unspoken understanding that even in victory, there was a price. Their minds and hearts were raw, and neither of them could shake the memory of what they had fought and lost. John had spent hours walking through the village, offering his help where he could, fixing roofs, reinforcing walls, and even planting new crops. But he knew he wasn't fully there. His mind often wandered back to the forest, where the land still felt heavy beneath his feet, where the air seemed to hum with memories of the entity's power. The markings on his wrist had long since faded, but the sensations that accompanied them lingered, an echo of something ancient, something dark. He had felt it again in the forest, a whisper, a sense that something still remained hidden there. Marla, too, found herself drawn to the land, but her approach was different. She spent hours each day among the villagers, listening to their stories, comforting the young and the elderly alike. She had always been the emotional pillar of the village, and even in the aftermath of the horror they had all endured, she maintained her steady strength. But in the quiet moments, when she was alone, she couldn't help but replay everything in her mind: the battle, the entity's twisted revelations, and the knowledge that the land itself had been corrupted by the pact. She wondered how long it would take before the land could truly heal. One evening, after a long day of work, Marla found herself alone at the edge of the village. She had been walking for hours, lost in thought, when she reached the forest's edge once more. The trees were silent, still, but the faint chill in the air reminded her of the darkness that had once thrived here. The place felt, strange now, calm, but uneasy. It was as if the land itself was caught in a moment of transition, still unsure whether it could fully release the darkness that had once consumed it. She wasn't alone for long. She turned to see John approaching, his face tired but resolute. He had been distant lately, his mind always elsewhere, lost in the weight of the events they had faced. But tonight, something was different in his eyes. There was a quiet understanding, an unspoken desire to face the lingering questions together. "I keep coming back here," he said, his voice carrying a tinge of sadness. "I feel like I need to understand it, I guess, to make sense of what happened." Marla nodded, her gaze shifting to the trees, where shadows stretched long in the fading light. "I've been coming here too. It's like the forest is still, waiting for something. And I don't know if we can ever really leave it behind, John. It's part of the land now. It's part of us." John walked up beside her, standing silently for a long moment. The wind rustled through the trees, the last traces of daylight slipping away. There was a palpable tension in the air, but also a feeling of shared understanding. They were standing at the crossroads of what had been and what could be. They had faced darkness, and they had survived. But they were still unsure of what that survival meant for their future. "We can't keep running from it, can we?" John said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "Even after all we've done, even after breaking the pact, the darkness is still here. Maybe it always will be." Marla turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "The darkness doesn't define us, John. It's part of us, yes, but we don't have to let it control us. We can choose to rebuild, to take back the land, to make it ours again." John's lips parted in a half smile, but the weight of the past still hung on him. He looked at her, seeing the resolve in her expression, and for a moment, he felt the same spark of hope that had first driven them both to fight the entity. "You're right," he said, his voice firmer now. "We've been through too much to let it take away what's left. The village, the land. It's ours now. We get to decide what happens next." They stood there in silence, the wind picking up, as if the land itself were listening. The darkness they had faced would never fully fade, but they knew now that they had the power to shape their own future. The land had been scarred by centuries of suffering, but with time, it could heal. And so could they. In the weeks that followed, Marla and John worked tirelessly to lead the village through the healing process. They helped restore homes and fields, but more importantly, they focused on mending the emotional wounds left by the terror the village had endured. The villagers, though fearful at first, slowly began to trust again, to rebuild the relationships that had been strained by years of darkness. The healing was slow, but with each passing day, it became clearer that the village would not be defined by its past. But there were still moments of unease. The shadow of the entity had not disappeared entirely, and the land still carried the remnants of its influence. Late at night, John would sometimes wake with the sensation that the earth beneath him was shifting, as if the shadows still lurked in the deep places, waiting. Marla would often feel the same, though they never spoke of it aloud. One evening, as the sun set in a fiery blaze of orange and purple, Marla stood once again at the edge of the forest. The air felt thick, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place. John joined her, standing side by side, their eyes drawn to the forest's dark edge. "I thought it would feel different," Marla said quietly, her voice distant, lost in thought. "After everything we've done, after all we've faced, I thought the land would be at peace. But I don't know if it ever truly can be." John placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a quiet comfort. "Maybe not, but we have time, and maybe that's enough." They stood there together for a long while, their gazes fixed on the forest, both wondering what the future would hold. They had defeated the entity, yes, but they had also learned a difficult truth: the land, the village, and all its people were forever intertwined with the darkness they had fought. The scars would remain, but they had the power to shape what came next. In the end, it was not about erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward together. And as the stars began to shine above them, John and Marla knew that whatever the land held, they would face it side by side, ready to embrace whatever came next. As time passed, the village continued to rebuild, its people slowly mending from the scars of the past. Life began to take on a new rhythm, one of cautious optimism, but the shadow of the land's past remained. The trees in the forest, though no longer twisted with malevolent energy, still seemed to hum with a quiet, unspoken tension. The villagers spoke of the entity less and less, but there were murmurs, sometimes late at night, about strange dreams, inexplicable occurrences, and a lingering feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the darkness. John and Marla, for all their progress, felt it too. Marla spent her days helping to restore the village's magic, weaving spells of protection around the land and strengthening the bond between the people and the earth. It was the work of a healer, someone who understood that magic wasn't just about power, it was about balance, about nurturing and restoring. But even her touch couldn't shake the feeling that something remained, something hidden beneath the surface, just waiting. John, on the other hand, took a more practical approach. He helped with the physical reconstruction, reinforced the village's defenses, and worked with the younger generation, teaching them how to use the knowledge they had gained in their fight. He wasn't ready to confront the lingering darkness in the same way that Marla was, but he couldn't ignore it either. His own connection to the past, to the entity and the pact, weighed heavily on him. He spent many nights walking the village's perimeter, scanning the horizon, feeling the pull of the forest. It was during one of these long walks that he began to feel it again. A faint vibration in the ground, a subtle change in the air. The sense that something was watching, something waiting. He paused near the edge of the forest, his heart racing as his instinct screamed that something was wrong. The feeling wasn't like the presence of the entity. This was something different, something more ancient, buried beneath the soil. It was as if the land itself was calling to him. "Marla," he muttered under his breath, turning toward the village, but the sound of her name felt hollow in the stillness of the evening. He knew she would feel it too, if he wasn't mistaken. She had always been attuned to the land in ways he couldn't fully understand. But this was something beyond what either of them had faced. He turned back to the dark woods and hesitated. His mind raced. There was so much still unknown about the entity's true nature, about what it had done to the land, and perhaps what it had left behind. The pact had been broken, but what if there were deeper, older forces at play? What if the entity wasn't the only one? What if there is something even more ancient beneath the surface? Without fully understanding why, he walked closer to the forest's edge, drawn by a quiet compulsion. His steps faltered as he felt the vibration grow stronger, the air growing cooler, heavier. The trees before him seemed to bend in a way they hadn't before, as if something in the darkness beneath them stirred. He didn't notice Marla until she appeared beside him, her presence calm but alert, her eyes scanning the forest as if she, too, felt the pull. "John," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the unease they both shared. "I feel it too." He nodded, his throat tight with the realization that he wasn't imagining it. "It's still here, Marla. Something is still here." Marla closed her eyes for a moment, her fingers brushing the symbols on her wrist, the ones that had marked her as the spellcaster of their generation, the one who could tap into the power of the land itself. She opened her eyes again, her gaze filled with both determination and fear. "We can't ignore it. Whatever this is, it's not gone. Not completely." They stood together for a long while, feeling the land beneath their feet tremble ever so slightly. It was as if the earth itself was alive, breathing, restless. They had no way of knowing just what they were facing, but they knew one thing: their work wasn't finished. The days that followed were filled with frantic investigation and preparation. Marla turned to the old tomes and scrolls that had once guided her in her study of magic, poring over them for any clue about ancient forces tied to the land, any hint of power that might have been left behind by the entity they had defeated. John spent hours digging through the village's records, searching for any traces of old folklore, of forgotten rituals that might shed light on what was happening. They both knew that they couldn't face whatever this was alone. The village was still fragile, the scars of the past too fresh for anyone to confront this unknown danger on their own. They needed the wisdom of the elders, the strength of the villagers, and a unity that had started to grow in the wake of the battle. Only together could they stand chance. But even as they prepared, there was a growing sense that the forest itself was closing in around them. Strange things began to happen, animals behaving erratically, the weather growing unpredictable, and whispers of strange happenings reaching the village. The tension in the air thickened. One night, as the moon high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the land, John and Marla stood once again at the edge of the forest. This time, however, they weren't alone. The villagers had gathered, the elders among them, along with a handful of younger people who had shown great promise in the work they had begun. The air felt electric, heavy with anticipation. "It's time," Marla said, her voice steady, though there was a tremor beneath the surface. "The land is calling. We need to confront whatever is still here." John nodded, stepping forward. He felt the weight of the past pressing down on him, but he also felt something else, a quiet resolve. Whatever this force was, whatever darkness had remained hidden, they would face it together. The villagers joined them, forming a circle around the edge of the forest. Each person placed their hand on the earth, connecting with the land in their own way. Some whispered prayers, others chanted in unison. The energy in the air crackled with raw power, the earth humming beneath their feet. For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest was still. The villagers waited, hearts pounding, as they stood at the edge of the unknown. Then, a sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and the earth beneath them rumbled. The ground cracked open before them, revealing a hidden chasm, dark and deep. A strange light flickered from within, pulsing with an unnatural energy. Something ancient and powerful stirred beneath the earth, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. John and Marla exchanged a look, their expressions a mixture of fear and determination. They had no choice now. The darkness wasn't finished with them, and whatever was coming from the depths of the land, it would need to be stopped. The ground beneath their feet trembled as the dark chasm before them widened, an eerie glow pulsing from within. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence fell over the gathered villagers. Everyone held their breath, waiting for whatever ancient force had awakened in the depths of the earth. John's heart raced, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He could feel the dark energy in the air, the same presence that had once ruled the land, but now, it seemed, different, more primal, more ancient. It wasn't just a single entity they faced anymore. It was something tied to the land itself, something that had been buried for centuries, perhaps millennia. Marla stepped forward, her hands still glowing faintly with magic, but even she seemed hesitant, her eyes scanning the dark, opening with unease. "We need to approach this carefully," she said, her voice low, her words almost drowned out by the distant rumble of the chasm. "This isn't just about power anymore. This is something deep within the earth, something older than anything we've fought." John could feel it, the thrum of power deep within the chasm. It called to him a low, almost hypnotic pull. His mind flashed back to the moments before the battle with the shadowy entity, when he had felt that same pull, when the markings on his wrist had burned and the entity had whispered to him. He could still hear the voice in his mind, distant but persistent. "Come closer. You're already part of this. The land is yours." His hand clenched around the staff, the magic within it still humming with a faint resonance. But this time, the staff felt different in his grip. It pulsed in time with the earth, like a heartbeat, as if it recognized the presence of something far older and far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Whatever this is," John said, his voice steady despite the dread creeping into his chest, "we can't let it take control. We need to stop it now before it's too late." Marla nodded, her face set with determination, though a flicker of doubt crossed her expression. "Agreed, but we don't know what we're truly dealing with. The entity we fought was bound to the land, but this could be a whole different kind of power." The ground rumbled again, and a dark mist began to rise from the chasm, swirling around them like tendrils of smoke. From deep within the chasm, a voice emerged, distorted and guttural, as though it came from the very bowels of the earth itself. "You cannot escape what is already yours. The earth is mine, and so are you." The villagers shuddered, some stepping back, their fear palpable. But Marla stood her ground, her magic flaring bright as she called upon the spells she had woven into the land. The symbols on her wrist glowed faintly, responding to the pull of the earth beneath her. The air crackled with energy, and the villagers, inspired by her strength, joined in, each of them pressing their hands to the ground, calling upon their connection to the land. The mist began to solidify into a shape, dark, formless, like a cloud of shadows given form. Slowly, the shadows twisted, taking on a more solid shape, until they became a figure, tall, ominous, its form hazy, as though it were both a part of the earth and something beyond it. It was not the entity they had faced before, but it felt like its older sibling, something ancient, predatory, and far more elusive. John's heart pounded. He could sense the power radiating from this being, a power that felt as though it could consume the entire village in an instant. You cannot bind me," the figure rumbled, its voice a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to echo from all around them. "I'm not your enemy. I am the earth. The earth is not bound by your petty spells. The pact is over, yes, but the land has always been mine." The figure's form flickered and shifted, as though it were made of the earth itself, trees, rocks, and soil that seemed to form and dissolve in a fluid, disorienting motion. "You are the ones who are bound," it continued. "Bound to this land, to me. You think you have freed it, but all you have done is awaken what has always slumbered." John felt the weight of its words settle in his chest like lead. The earth beneath him seemed to grow colder, more alive. He could almost hear it whispering, as though the land itself was alive and aware, watching, waiting. Marla raised her hands, the power swirling around her as she prepared to cast her spell, but the figure laughed, low and rumbling like distant thunder. "You cannot stop me," it said, its form expanding as the ground quaked. I am as old as time itself. You may have defeated the shadow, but the land is eternal. It has always held power, and it always will. Then we will fight for it, Marla said, her voice firm, unwavering. This land may be ancient, but it belongs to the people now. We won't let you take it. The figure hesitated, as if considering her words, before it reached toward them with its shadowy tendrils, stretching out like the roots of an ancient tree. The air thickened with a pressure that was almost suffocating. John stepped forward, his hand tightening around the staff. He could feel the power within it, the same power that had once been used to bind the entity. But this felt different. It wasn't just about raw power, it was about balance. He had to tap into something deeper. He closed his eyes, focusing on the earth beneath him, the pulse of the land. He could feel it now, not just the darkness, but the life that had always been there, the subtle hum of energy that flowed through the trees, the grass, the stones. It was alive, vibrant, and it was his. He had always been connected to it, just as it had always been connected to him. Together, John whispered, his voice steady, calling out to Marla. "We can do this." Marla turned to him, her gaze meeting his with a flicker of understanding. The land was alive. The darkness could not be vanquished by force alone. It had to be understood, balanced. They had both come to this place for a reason, and together they could reshape the future of the land. With a shared, silent resolve, they raised their hands. The villagers joined them, forming a circle around the chasm, their magic flowing into the ground beneath them. The figure, sensing the power building around it, shrieked in fury, but it was too late. The balance was shifting, the earth beneath them responding. The energy of the land surged upward, pushing back against the figure's dark tendrils. The shadows began to crack and fracture, the earth shaking violently as the power of the land itself rose to meet the darkness. "You cannot own us," Marla cried, her voice fierce as she poured all her energy into the spell. The figure screamed, its form writhing as the ground split open beneath it. But just as the darkness began to collapse in on itself, John reached out, channeling the power of the land through his staff. A blinding flash of light erupted, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then, silence. When the light faded, the chasm was gone. The earth was still. The shadows had dissipated, and the oppressive air had lifted. John and Marla stood, breathing heavily, as the villagers began to murmur in disbelief. They had done it. The ancient force had been quelled, at least for now. The land, though scarred, was no longer under the control of the darkness. They had freed it. But even as they stood victorious, John felt a lingering question in his heart. What had they truly released from the earth? And could they ever truly be free from the land's ancient, binding power? For now, though, there was peace. And with time, they would rebuild not just the village, but the connection between the land and its people. The days that followed were filled with cautious relief. The villagers, though shaken, were resilient. The land, still recovering from the strain of centuries of darkness, began to show signs of healing. The trees, once twisted and gnarled, now seemed to stand taller, their leaves slowly returning to a more vibrant green. The soil, once tainted, started to breathe again, the land pulsing with life instead of death. But John and Marla both knew that their victory, though significant, was only part of a much larger story. They had quelled the immediate threat, but the land was far more complicated than they had ever realized. There were things beneath the surface that they still did not fully understand. The village had begun to rebuild its foundations, both physical and magical. The elders worked to restore the wards that once protected the town, strengthening their spells of protection against any future threats. Marla spent long hours in the village's library, poring over old tomes, trying to learn more about the ancient power that had stirred beneath the earth. The connection between the land and the dark entity was deep, far deeper than they could have ever anticipated. It was clear now that the force they had faced was just one facet of a much older, more profound magic, one tied to the very essence of the land itself. John, too, felt the pull of the earth, but it wasn't just a lingering shadow. It was a kind of connection, a bond he didn't fully understand. He had felt the pulse of the land during the battle, had felt the power surge through him. It was as if something had awakened within him as well, an ancient tie to the earth, to the magic that flowed through it. He had never been particularly attuned to magic in the way that Marla was, but now it seemed as if the land itself was speaking to him, calling him to understand it, to learn from it. But with that connection came an unease. For every step forward in their recovery, John felt an underlying tension. The land was not done with them, and neither was the force that had been buried for so long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light over the village, John stood at the edge of the forest again, his gaze fixed on the trees. He could feel it, the same pulse, the same vibration in the ground. It was as if the land was alive, whispering to him. Marla approached, her footsteps soft on the earth. She too had sensed it. "It's not over, is it?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an underlying uncertainty. John shook his head. "No, it's not. The land. It's different now, but it's not fully healed. Something deeper still remains." Marla nodded, her expression troubled. "I've been researching the old spells, the ancient magic tied to the land. There's something I've found that doesn't make sense, though. The entity we faced, it wasn't just a manifestation of darkness. It was part of a cycle tied to the land's energy, to the way the earth has always fed on its inhabitants. The land isn't just a place. It's a living, breathing entity, too." John turned to her, his brow furrowing. "You mean the land itself is connected to the darkness? What does that mean for us?" Marla hesitated before speaking, her voice soft, almost reverent. "The land is bound to an ancient force, a force that can't just be fought. It must be balanced. The entity we faced was an avatar of that force, but it was not the force itself. The true power lies beneath us, inside the earth. It's the source of everything, the life, the death, the power. And it's not something that can simply be destroyed." John felt a chill settle over him. The air around them seemed to thicken, the weight of Marla's words sinking in. The land was not just something they could save or destroy. It was a living thing, a force that couldn't be easily controlled or understood. "So what does that mean for us?" John asked, his voice low. "It means we have to learn to live with it," Marla replied. "The land will always be there, its magic flowing beneath the surface. But it's not evil. It's not good either. It's neutral. We have to find a way to coexist with it, to work with its cycles instead of trying to control them." John thought for a moment, the pieces starting to fall into place. He had felt the pull of the land, too, the connection. It wasn't a curse. It was a bond, a relationship. The earth was not their enemy, but neither was it a simple ally. It was a powerful, unpredictable force that they could not ignore. "Is that why I felt it too?" John asked, looking at his hands, still tingling with the residue of magic. "The land. It's calling us. It's tied to me now." Marla nodded, her eyes filled with both understanding and concern. "The land recognizes you. It recognizes what you did, how you helped break the cycle. But it's not a one-time thing. This connection, it's not something that can be easily severed. You're part of it now, John." The weight of her words settled over him like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. John had always been a protector, someone who fought to defend the people he loved. But now, this connection to the earth made him feel like something more, something deeper. He had always thought that magic and power were external things, tools that could be used for good or ill. But now he realized that power was inside him. The land's magic had become part of him. "I don't know what to do with this," he said quietly. "How do we live with it? How do we control something that powerful?" "We don't," Marla said gently. "We coexist with it. We listen to it. The land is not a thing to be controlled. It's a force to be understood. Together, we'll learn how to live with it. But even as she spoke, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something much larger, something that none of them truly understood. The earth was alive, but it was not always kind. There would be more challenges ahead, more mysteries to uncover. The next few weeks were filled with preparation and study. John worked closely with Marla, learning more about the land's history, the ancient forces that had once ruled it, and the way magic flowed through the earth. He trained his mind and body, learning to feel the subtle pulses beneath his feet and harness the energy that flowed through the soil. It was slow work, and there were many times when John felt frustrated, uncertain. But with Marla by his side, they made progress. Then, one evening, as they stood together once more at the edge forest, something shifted. The air grew thick, as if the land itself had become aware of their presence. The ground hummed beneath their feet, and in the distance, the trees began to move, shifting, bending in unnatural patterns, as if reaching for them. Marla and John exchanged a glance, a mixture of awe and fear. The land was not finished with them, and this time, the challenge would be unlike anything they had faced before. The wind howled as the trees shifted unnaturally, their branches twisting toward John and Marla, as if drawn by an invisible force. The land beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself was alive and aware of their presence. The subtle hum of magic, once a distant, almost comforting pulse, now thrummed with an ominous intensity. Something had changed. "We're not alone," John whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it in the air, a presence that was not the calm hum of the earth, but something more ancient and primal, as though the land itself was waking from a deep slumber. Marla's hand instinctively reached for her staff, her fingers glowing faintly with magic, but her expression was tense. The land's balance is shifting. Whatever we did, it stirred something, or someone, and it's coming for us. Before they could react, the ground beneath them split open with a deafening crack, sending a shockwave of energy through the air. The trees shook violently, their roots lifting from the earth, as though something below was reaching up to claim them. A dark figure emerged from the chasm in the earth, its form vague and shifting like a shadow, but with an unmistakable presence, a force that radiated power and ancient malice. John's breath caught in his throat. The figure was massive, its form dark and formless, but its eyes, glowing with an unnatural, otherworldly light, locked onto them, burning with a hunger that seemed to resonate deep in his bones. It's the land itself," Marla breathed, her voice filled with awe and fear. "It's not just a spirit, not just an entity. This is the Earth's will, its manifestation, a guardian, but one twisted by the cycles of destruction." John's mind raced. He had felt the connection to the land, but he hadn't realized the true extent of its power. This thing was not a simple force of nature. It was the embodiment of the Earth's darker nature, a creature bound to protect the land by any means necessary, even at the cost of everything that lived on it. The figure's voice, deep and rumbling like the sound of rocks grinding against one another, echoed through the air. "You dare awaken me? You dare disturb the eternal cycle? You are fools to think you can break the land's will. I am the soil, the stone, the very blood of the earth. You cannot escape what you have stirred." John's grip tightened on his staff, the familiar pulse of magic surging through him. It was faint, but he could feel the energy of the land responding to him, a subtle pull, as though the earth itself was reaching out to him. But this was different from the last time. This wasn't the land's magic imbalance. This was something dark and twisted, a force that had been lying dormant for centuries, perhaps longer. "We didn't mean to disturb anything," Marla called out, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "We only wanted to restore balance. The land was poisoned. We freed it from the shadows." The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its form coiling like smoke around the trees, the ground shuddering beneath its presence. You do not understand. The shadow was part of the land's balance. It was a necessary force. Without it, there could be no life, no death. There is no order without destruction. You have broken the cycle, and now you must pay the price. The earth rumbled again, a deep growl echoing through the air. John felt the pull of the land again, but it was no longer just a connection, it was a warning. The power he had felt before, the magic he had tapped into, was both a gift and a curse. The land was alive, and it wanted something from him. No, John said, his voice stronger now, though doubt still gnawed at him. We're not going to let this cycle continue. We won't be slaves to a land that feeds on destruction. The figure's form twisted violently, its shadowy limbs stretching toward them like tendrils of darkness, reaching for their throats, for their very souls. You will understand, in time, it hissed. You are part of this land now. There is no escape. As the tendrils of shadow lunged at them, John felt the magic surge within him. His staff pulsed, its energy flowing like a torrent through his body. With a cry, he raised it high, and the ground beneath him cracked open, splitting in a jagged line that reached for the figure. The power of the earth itself seemed to respond, the chasm widening as the land reached back at the dark force that sought to control it. But even as John's magic fought back against the figure, he realized with growing horror that it wasn't enough. This creature was not just a manifestation of the land, it was the land. It was an ancient force tied to the cycles of life and death, and no spell, no magic could easily undo that. We can't just fight it, Marla said, her voice urgent as she joined John at the center of the struggle, her staff glowing with energy. We need to find a way to restore the balance, to return things to their rightful state. John's mind raced. How could they possibly do that? The figure, the Earth's guardian, was far too powerful for them to defeat outright. It wasn't just a creature they were facing. It was a primal force, a manifestation of the Earth's will itself. They couldn't simply fight it, they needed to understand it, to restore the balance that had been disrupted. We need to connect to the land, John said, his voice suddenly clear with understanding. We've been fighting it, but the land itself, it's part of us now. We need to merge with it, to use its power, not as adversaries, but as partners. Marla nodded, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. You're right. We have to become the balance, not just fight it. We need to restore the land's true purpose. The figure let out a shriek of rage, sensing the shift in their approach. It lashed out with its dark tendrils, but this time, John and Marla stood firm. With the Earth's magic pulsing through them, they extended their hands, their magic weaving together into a single thread of power, a lifeline that tied them to the land itself. The figure recoiled, its form rippling and distorting as it realized they were no longer just opposing forces. John and Marla had become part of the land, part of the cycle, part of the balance. They weren't fighting to destroy it anymore. They were fighting to restore it. In that moment, the land itself responded. The earth trembled, and the air grew still. The dark figure let out a final, anguished howl before its form began to dissolve, breaking apart like sand in the wind, its power bleeding back into the soil. As the last of the darkness vanished, John and Marla collapsed to their knees, exhausted but triumphant. The earth beneath them hummed with life, no longer a force of destruction, but of balance. But even as they recovered, John knew that their journey was far from over. The land had tested them, had shown them its true power, and now they had to learn to live with it, learn how to nurture and protect the balance they had so nearly destroyed. The land was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and they were its stewards, for better or worse. The night grew darker, and the once familiar sounds of the forest seemed to warp, bending into something eerie. The trees, which had always whispered in the wind, now groaned, their trunks twisting unnaturally. John felt his heart skip a beat, the pulse of the earth beneath him suddenly far more forceful, more insistent. Marla stiffened beside him. She too felt it. The magic in the air was thickening, the presence of the land shifting again, as though it were waking once more from a deep, slumbering dream. It was no longer the subtle hum they had grown accustomed to. It was a full, vibrating force, a tangible, living thing, pulsating with a quiet power that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Something's wrong," Marla said, her voice strained as she raised her hand, the glow of her magic flickering in the growing darkness. "This isn't just a disturbance in the magic. It's like the land itself is trying to communicate." John could feel the pressure in the air, the earth beneath him trembling ever so slightly. The soil, the rocks, the very ground he stood on, they seemed to be alive, shifting, responding to something they could not yet understand. He looked toward the trees, their shadows growing longer, more twisted, and then something moved among them. A figure, cloaked in darkness, tall and shifting, its form both human and not. The figure glided silently through the trees, its presence chilling, as though it was one with the land itself. It did not seem entirely corporeal, yet it radiated a suffocating, malevolent energy. John's heart raced, the blood in his veins turning to ice. He could feel the presence of the land pulsing in a way that was wrong. The balance that they had fought so hard to restore was shifting again, slipping into something far darker, far more dangerous. Marla stepped forward, her hand glowing brighter as she summoned her magic, though there was a hesitation in her movements. The power she was drawing from the earth seemed to waver, as if the land was resisting her efforts. What are you?" John called out, his voice steady but strained. He felt the weight of the land's magic pressing down on him, trying to swallow him whole. The figure paused, and for a moment, all was still. Then it spoke. "You should not have interfered." The voice was like the rumble of thunder, a deep, unearthly growl that shook the very air. It was not a voice, but a presence, a sound that echoed in their minds. John's hands clenched into fists. "We didn't interfere," he said, trying to stand his ground. "We freed the land. We broke the cycle." The figure's shadowed form seemed to flicker, its outline shifting like smoke. It stepped closer, and with each step, the earth beneath them seemed to warp, bending and groaning in protest. The darkness surrounding it thickened, swallowing the light from Marla's magic. "Freed?" The figure scoffed. "The cycle is not meant to be broken. You did not free the land. You disturbed its natural flow, awakening forces that were never meant to rise again. You have brought imbalance, and now the land calls for balance to be restored." Marla's expression grew harder. She could feel the land fighting against her, against them. It was as if the earth itself had turned its back on them, unwilling to accept their presence anymore. "Balance," she said sharply, stepping forward, determination in her eyes. "You speak of balance, but this darkness you brought, it's not balance. It's corruption. We can live with the land, but not like this. Not under your control." The figure laughed, low and cold, as it continued to step closer. "You cannot control what you do not understand. The land has no master. It is neither light nor dark. It simply is. The cycle will continue. It must. It always does." John felt his mind racing. This was something beyond their comprehension. This figure wasn't just a manifestation of darkness or an ancient entity. It was something tied to the very fabric of the land's existence. If they couldn't find a way to restore the balance, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for them, but for the entire world. "What do you want from us?" John asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "We've fought for this land. We've fought for its people. You can't just take it back." The figure paused, its form rippling like water. It tilted its head, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. "I do not take. I reclaim. The land is mine. It always was. The cycle of life, of death, of power, it is mine to govern." And then, in a flash of movement that was too fast for them to follow, the figure lunged. In an instant, the earth beneath them erupted. Dark tendrils of power shot up from the ground, wrapping around John and Marla like snakes, their bodies being pulled toward the figure, toward the center of the land where the pulse of energy throbbed. Marla cried out, her magic flaring as she tried to push back against the tendrils. But the power of the land was too great. It was as if the earth itself had turned against them, its will stronger than their combined forces. John felt his breath leave him as he was dragged toward the figure, his feet leaving the ground. It was the pull of something ancient, something he couldn't escape. "You are connected to me now," the figure's voice boomed in their minds. "And so you will remain. You will serve the land's will." John's heart pounded as the tendrils tightened around him. His thoughts were clouded, the land's power surging through his veins, choking him. It wasn't just the figure, they were bound to the land, to its very essence, and they couldn't escape. He could feel the connection growing stronger, the earth's pulse growing louder in his head, drowning out all other thoughts. In that moment, he realized the true depth of their struggle. It wasn't just about fighting a force of darkness or evil, it was about understanding the land itself, the force that controlled everything beneath their feet. They had been foolish to think they could tame it. And now, the earth had come for them. But then, through the darkness, through the growing pressure of the land's power, something clicked in John's mind. He was connected to the earth. He had always been connected to it, just as Marla had been attuned to the magic that flowed through it. But now, the land wasn't something he could simply fight. He had to become part of it. With a sudden, desperate surge of will, John reached deep within himself. He focused not on resisting, not on fighting the land's power, but on aligning with it. He felt the magic of the earth flowing through him, familiar, ancient, powerful. It was a raw, primal force. It wasn't a force to control, but a force to work with. The tendrils hesitated, as though the land itself had felt his shift. John reached out, his hand glowing with energy, and in an instant, he felt a pulse of energy surge through him. The earth beneath him rumbled, a deep, primordial sound. "I won't fight you," John said, his voice steady and clear. "I will work with you." For a moment, everything was still. Then, the tendrils loosened, the pressure on his chest easing. The figure's form wavered, its shadowy presence flickering, as if uncertain. And slowly, the darkness began to recede, not in defeat, but in acceptance. The land was not theirs to control, but it was theirs to understand. And with this understanding, they would find a way to live in balance with it. The days that followed were a mixture of restoration and quiet reflection. The village had felt the earth's pulse more strongly than ever before, as if the very soil beneath their feet had become attuned to the balance that John and Marla had forged. Though the immediate danger had passed, the world around them felt altered, and the people of the village could sense the change. There was a new energy in the air, a vibration that resonated through the ground, both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. John and Marla spent their days in the village's center, surrounded by the ancient texts and arcane symbols that had once been the domain of the elders. There was much to learn, much to understand, but they also knew that knowledge alone wouldn't be enough to control what they had awakened. The land was not simply a passive entity to be controlled. It was a dynamic force, one that shifted and changed with the flow of time, responding to the will of those who walked upon it. As John spent more time with the earth, he began to realize that his connection to it had grown stronger. He could feel the subtle changes in the wind, the fluctuations in the soil beneath him, even the way the plants grew in patterns that seemed to mirror his own emotional states. The bond was deeper than he had ever imagined. At first, it was disorienting. Sometimes he would feel the land's anger, a tremor in the ground, a chill in the air, as if the earth itself was displeased with something. At other times, there would be a sense of peace, an overwhelming calm, as though the earth was content with the changes. But it wasn't just a force that could be read like weather. It was a complex web of emotions, a life that pulsed and breathed beneath the surface. Marla was the more pragmatic of the two, spending hours studying the old tomes and working on rituals to communicate with the land in a more structured, controlled way. She had always been attuned to magic, but now she had to learn how to communicate with the land itself. She would stand in the heart of the village, her staff planted firmly in the ground, as she cast intricate spells designed to strengthen their connection, to stabilize the ebb and flow of energy that had threatened to tear the land apart. But even as they worked to strengthen the balance, they could feel that the land was not done testing them. There were times when John would feel a cold shiver run through him, as though the land was warning him of something to come. Other times, the whispers of the earth were almost impossible to ignore, faint murmurs that seemed to echo from deep within the ground. It was as if the earth itself was calling to them, urging them to listen, to understand its true nature. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the village settled into a quiet lull, John stood alone at the edge of the forest once more. The trees around him swayed in the breeze, but something felt off. The pulse of the earth, usually steady and calm, had become erratic. He closed his eyes and focused, reaching out with his senses. The land's energy was shifting, fluctuating, like the heartbeat of a living creature, growing more erratic by the moment. There was something underneath, something deep within the earth that had awakened again. But it wasn't just a presence, it was a call. A low rumble echoed from deep within the ground. John's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. The earth beneath him trembled, and he could feel the familiar pull, the sensation of magic, but twisted and dark. Something was stirring deep below them, something ancient and powerful, and it was reaching out to him. Before he could react, the ground split open again, wider and faster than before. A vortex of shadow and flame erupted from the chasm, swirling in a maelstrom of darkness. The trees bent violently, their roots pulling from the earth as the force of the eruption sent shockwaves through the land. From the depths of the chasm, a figure rose. This time, it was not the same. As before, this figure was solid, humanoid, but composed of shifting stone, flame, and earth, a creature made of the very elements that had once protected the land. This was no avatar of destruction. It was something else. It was a guardian, but not one of light. It was a manifestation of the land's raw, primal force, its fury and wrath, untamed and unyielding. It stood before John, towering above him, its molten eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to match the chaos it caused. "You are the ones who disturbed the natural order." The creature's voice rumbled, deep and resonant, shaking the very air. "You who have broken the cycles of life and death, who have meddled with forces you do not understand. The land's fury will be your reckoning." John stood firm, his pulse quickening, the weight of the creature's words sinking in. This wasn't a force of evil, nor was it a purely destructive force. This was the land's anger, a manifestation of its need to protect itself from those who sought to change it. "We didn't break anything," John said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We restored balance. The land was dying. The cycles were corrupted. We set things right." The creature tilted its head, its molten eyes narrowing. "You think you restored balance? You think that what you've done is enough to satisfy the land's thirst? You are mistaken. The cycles are not yours to alter. The land needs destruction to survive. Without it, everything will wither and die." John felt the ground beneath him shift again, the pull of the land's magic strengthening as the creature raised its hand, summoning a storm of fire and stone. The wind howled as the earth trembled beneath them, and John realized with a jolt of horror that the creature was not merely attacking, it was testing him. The pulse of magic within him flared again, his connection to the earth more of the land, the ancient cycles of life, death, and rebirth. The creature, in its fury, represented one side of that cycle, destruction. But John now understood that true balance required both creation and destruction, life and death. Neither could exist without the other. Enough, John said, his voice rising above the roar of the storm. We will not fight the land, but we will not allow it to destroy everything either. The cycles must change. Balance must be restored. As he spoke, the earth around him responded. His staff glowed brighter, the magic surging within him, intertwining with the land's energy. The earth's fury was powerful, but it was no longer a force that sought to overwhelm him. With the strength of his bond to the land, he felt the magic shift. He could feel the balance returning, as though the earth itself was listening to his plea. The creature's form wavered, its molten eyes flashing with uncertainty. For the first time, it hesitated. You cannot change what has been since the beginning of time, it warned, but its voice had lost some of its force. We're not changing it, John replied, his gaze unwavering. We're restoring it. This land can survive, but it needs more than destruction. It needs both. For a long moment, the two forces, John's magic and the creature's rage, clashed. But as the energy of the earth surged through him, John understood that the land had one final test for them. He had to prove that he could walk the line between life and death, creation and destruction, light and dark. With a final, overwhelming surge of magic, the storm began to subside, the fire and stone dissipating as the creature's form began to dissolve. Slowly, it lowered its hand, the anger fading from its molten eyes. You are the steward of the land now, it said, its voice fading into the wind. But understand this, you will never be in control. You will only be its keeper. And with that, the creature vanished into the earth, leaving John standing alone at the edge of the forest, the land humming with an energy that felt both calming and foreboding. As the tendrils of dark energy slowly withdrew, the pressure on John's chest lifted, and the earth beneath him began to settle. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air seemed to dissipate, but the silence that followed was deep and heavy, filled with the weight of the truth that had just been revealed. John's connection to the land was not just a passive bond. It was part of an ancient, complex cycle, a force far greater than either he or Marla could have ever imagined. The figure before them, though still cloaked in darkness, no longer felt threatening. Its presence shifted from one of aggression to something more thoughtful, almost curious. It no longer lunged at them, but instead, it hovered, its form swirling like a vortex, the shadows within it twisting and writhing as if the figure was considering what had just transpired. John, still feeling the pulse of the earth coursing through him, took a tentative step forward. He was still unsure, but something inside him had changed. He no longer felt like an outsider trying to understand the land. He was the land. He could feel it deep in his bones, a truth that resonated in his very soul. I didn't come to control you, John said, his voice steady, but his heart pounding. I came to understand you. We came to restore balance. The figure seemed to contemplate this, its shape flickering and shifting. It spoke again, its voice no longer a growl, but a deep, reverberating tone that echoed not just in their minds, but in the very air around them. Balance cannot be restored with only understanding, it said. You cannot restore what was never broken. The cycle is a constant, a flow of life and death. You cannot stop it, but you can learn to live with it. The land does not need you to heal it, but to coexist with it. John and Marla exchange a look. Marla's expression was one of deep thought, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was processing everything, just as John was. This wasn't a fight they had to win. This was something deeper. A way of life, an eternal connection that they had never fully grasped. I know now that we're not here to change the land. Marla spoke up, her voice calm but resolute. We're here to learn how to live with it, to live in harmony. We are part of it, and the land is part of us. The figure seemed to pause, as if considering her words. Then, in a movement so fluid, so graceful, it almost felt like the wind itself was speaking, it stepped closer to them. "Then you will be tested," it said, its voice now a whisper of inevitability. "If you wish to coexist, you must first prove that you understand the nature of the land. You will face challenges, trials that will test your bond to the earth. Only then will the cycle allow you to remain." Before John or Marla could speak, the figure began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like mist in the wind. As it vanished, the earth seemed to hum once more, its pulse growing stronger, as if to echo the final words of the figure. John felt the ground beneath him shift, and for a moment, it felt as though the very earth had begun to open beneath him. The connection between him and the land pulsed again, and this time, it felt like an invitation, a call to something greater. Suddenly, the land around them transformed. The once familiar forest now appeared different, darker, more alive in a way that was unsettling. The trees loomed over them, their roots stretching out like fingers. The air grew thick with the scent of earth and decay, and in the distance, strange, glowing lights flickered like fireflies, only they weren't quite natural. Marla stepped forward, her hand raised to shield her eyes from the glowing lights. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice laced with awe and fear. "I don't know," John replied, his own voice uncertain as he took a step toward the lights. "But it's part of the land's test, isn't it?" A low rumble echoed through the earth, and then, from the depths of the shadows, a shape emerged, one that was too large to be just a tree, too moving to be a creature of stone. It was like an enormous, gnarled root, twisted, dark, and moving with a will of its own. As it rose from the ground, more shapes began to emerge around them. The forest, the earth itself, seemed to come alive in ways they could not comprehend. Creatures made of bark and bone, leaves and shadow, began to form from the trees, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. "These are the guardians of the land," Marla said quietly, her voice full of reverence. "They've been here for centuries, watching over the cycle, testing those who would try to change it." John felt the weight of the words settle over him. These beings, these guardians, they weren't enemies. They were manifestations of the Earth's will. They existed to ensure the balance, to maintain the cycle. And now, they were here to test him and Marla. One of the creatures, a towering figure with limbs like twisted roots, stepped forward. Its voice was deep and rumbling, like the sound of trees creaking in the wind. "You are not yet ready to walk with the land," it said, its voice shaking the ground beneath them. "Prove your understanding, prove your bond. Only then can you hope to coexist. Fail, and the land will reclaim you." Marla stood tall beside John, her eyes glowing with the light of her magic. "We've already proven we can fight," she said. "But we understand now. We're not here to control the land. We're here to listen. We're here to learn." The Guardian did not respond at first. It merely stared at them, its glowing eyes piercing through them, as if searching their very souls. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the creature lowered its head. "You will face the trials," it intoned. "Only then will you know if you truly understand the land's will." The ground beneath them trembled, and suddenly, the earth split wide open. From the rift, a massive storm of swirling winds, earth, and fire erupted, an elemental fury that seemed to come from deep within the land itself. John's heart raced as the forces of nature threatened to overwhelm them. But he didn't panic. He could feel it now, the pulse of the earth beneath him. This wasn't a fight against something outside of him. It was a test of his connection to the land, a challenge to prove his understanding of the earth's power and purpose. Beside him, Marla's magic flared, the light from her hands clashing against the swirling darkness. Together, they were ready to face whatever trials the land would throw at them. The true test had begun. The wind howled, carrying with it the smell of earth and flame, as the massive storm swirled around them. John could feel the land's fury growing stronger with every passing second, its wrath surging like a tidal wave of energy, as though it was challenging him to prove his worth. The guardians stood motionless, their eyes burning with an intensity that spoke of ancient knowledge, as if this was a ritual older than time itself. "Stay close," Marla whispered, her voice calm but firm. Her staff glowed brightly, a beacon of light in the chaotic maelstrom that surrounded them. She extended her hand to John, and as their fingers brushed, he felt a surge of magic pulse between them, a connection that felt deeper than mere physical touch. "I can feel it," John said, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he steadied himself. The pulse of the earth beneath his feet had become a rhythmic beat, like a heart beating deep in the soil, and it was growing louder, more urgent. "The land is angry, but it's also testing us. We have to prove we understand," Marla murmured. "The trials, they're not just about magic or strength. It's about balance." As if to answer her, the storm intensified, and from the swirling winds, a massive form emerged. It was a creature of stone, fire, and smoke. Its body was a tangled mass of roots, rocks, and molten flame. The air around it shimmered with heat, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. The guardian, the ancient force of the earth, stood silent, watching. The creature moved, its steps slow and deliberate, its molten eyes locking onto John and Marla. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The message was clear. The trial had begun. John stepped forward first, planting his feet firmly into the earth beneath him. He reached deep within himself, tapping into the magic that flowed through the land, through him. The power surged within him, and for a moment, he felt one with the earth, as though his soul had merged with the very pulse of the world. The creature lunged. With a swift motion, John raised his hands, feeling the earth respond to his will. The ground cracked open beneath him, forming a barrier of stone and roots that pushed the creature back. It howled in frustration, its molten hands striking at the barrier, sending sparks flying into the air. But the more it struck, the more the land seemed to shift in response. The stones seemed to absorb its power, growing stronger with every blow. "Keep it contained," Marla shouted, raising her staff high. "We need to understand the flow, not just control it." John nodded, his focus unwavering. He could feel the earth's pulse racing in his veins, and as the creature struggled, something inside him began to shift. The storm was no longer just a threat. It was a force that had its own rhythm, its own pattern. John wasn't fighting against it. He was becoming a part of it. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, grounding himself. And then he reached deeper than before, into the flow of the earth's energy. The storm roared around him, but he didn't flinch. The winds, the fire, the stones, they were not enemies. They were part of the cycle. Life and death, growth and decay. With that realization, the storm began to calm. The earth beneath him settled, the winds died down, and the flames that had once threatened to consume them began to flicker out. The massive creature, the guardian, stood still, its fiery eyes watching him closely. John's pulse slowed. He could feel the land's energy ebbing, but not in defeat. In understanding. "We're not here to conquer," he whispered to himself, but it was loud enough for Marla to hear. "We're here to coexist." The creature, as if sensing his change, let out a low, resonating growl. Its molten eyes shifted from fury to something else, curiosity. And then it took a step back, its massive form dissolving into the earth once more. The storm that had once raged around them dissipated like smoke, and silence fell. The air felt thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The guardians, standing at the edges of the clearing, nodded in unison, their eyes filled with approval. The trial was not one of brute force or destruction, but of understanding, a true understanding of the land's power and purpose. John exhaled deeply, feeling the tension release from his body. He turned to Marla, who was still standing beside him, her hand tightly gripping her staff. "We did it," she said quietly, her voice almost in disbelief. John nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. We didn't fight the land. We listened to it. We became a part of it. But even as they stood there, basking in the calm that followed, John couldn't shake the feeling that the trials were far from over. The land had tested them, yes, but it was also watching, waiting. A voice broke the silence. It was the same voice they had heard from the creature before, but this time it was softer, more like a whisper in the wind. The land is not yours to control, it said, but you have proven yourselves worthy of its trust. You may now walk its path, side by side with the earth. But remember, balance is fragile. The cycle is eternal. You will face many more trials, for the land is always changing, always shifting. Be prepared. John and Marla exchanged a glance, both of them understanding the gravity of what had just been said. They had earned the right to walk with the land, but it came with an unspoken truth. Their journey was far from over. As the Guardians slowly faded into the forest, leaving John and Marla standing together in the clearing, they both felt the weight of their new responsibilities. The land was alive, and their bond with it would be tested time and again. The earth was patient, but it was also unforgiving. Together, they would continue on their path, their purpose ever more clear, to protect the balance, to live with the land, and to honor the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. But as they turned to leave the clearing, a final thought lingered in John's mind, a thought born from the final words of the Guardian. The greatest trial was yet to come. As John and Marla made their way back through the dense forest, the weight of their success settled in their bones, but an unsettling feeling gnawed at the edges of their minds. They had proven their understanding of the land's cycles, but the final words of the Guardian echoed in John's thoughts. The greatest trial was yet to come. The trees around them had returned to their normal, ancient stillness, but everything felt different now. The forest seemed more alive, and yet there was a palpable tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The connection they had forged with the earth was deep and intimate, but it also made them feel vulnerable. They weren't just stewards anymore. They were part of a living, breathing system that was always in flux. What do you think it meant? Marla's voice broke the silence, her tone thoughtful as she walked beside him. Her staff glowed softly in the growing dusk, a small beacon against the encroaching shadows. John shook his head, still unsure. I don't know. I thought maybe that was it, that the land had tested us, and now we were free to help it heal. That might be true, Marla said, her brow furrowed. But something about that last part, it felt like a warning, a promise, but also a threat. The land's trials are ongoing, and it's not done with us yet. They paused for a moment in the shadow of a great oak, the ancient tree towering above them like a silent sentinel. The ground beneath their feet hummed with life, more vibrant than ever before. The faint sound of wind through the leaves felt like a song, a lullaby woven into the fabric of the forest itself. But even as they stood in the quiet, John could feel the pull of something deeper, something other. It wasn't the familiar, steady heartbeat of the land. It was an unsettling shift in the rhythm, as though something had begun to stir. I've been thinking about something, John said, his voice quieter than usual. When the Guardian spoke, they mentioned the cycle life, death, rebirth. But they didn't explain why things need to die. Not everything can be restored. The land, it's alive, but it needs destruction too to survive. Marla nodded slowly. It's a lesson we learned, but one that's hard to swallow. Everything, every living thing, needs both growth and decay. It's how the land renews itself. But what happens when the balance tips too far in one direction? John felt a shiver creep down his spine as the words left her mouth. That was the very thought that had been haunting him, the idea that while they had restored balance in their small corner of the land, something much larger, much more dangerous, might still be out of balance elsewhere. The feeling of unease deepened as they continued walking, the silence of the forest growing heavier. They had learned to understand the land's rhythm. But they also understood that this harmony could be disrupted not just by force, but by time itself. The natural balance of life and death was delicate, and without careful stewardship, it could fracture. They came to a clearing they hadn't seen before, a darkened hollow within the forest that seemed out of place. A chill ran through John's chest as he took in the sight before him. The trees here were twisted, their bark blackened as though scorched by fire, their leaves withered and brittle. The air felt thick, charged with a dark energy that clung to the space like a fog. "This wasn't here before," Marla whispered, her voice almost reverent, but filled with suspicion. "Something has corrupted this place." John felt a wave of nausea hit him as the land beneath his feet shifted. He reached out, trying to tap into the earth's pulse, but it was faint, distant, like the land itself was sick. The rhythm they had once felt was gone, replaced by a cold void. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tight. "Something's wrong here. This isn't part of the land's natural flow." But as they turned to leave, the ground beneath them trembled once more. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt figure with a hooded cloak made of leaves and vines. Its face was hidden, but its presence was unmistakable. The air around it crackled with a dark energy that twisted the very forest into something unrecognizable. "Who are you?" John called, his hand instinctively reaching for the staff at his side. The figure raised its head, revealing a face as pale as moonlight, its eyes deep pits of blackness. There was no emotion in its gaze, only an empty, hollow void that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. "I'm the keeper of the decay," it said, its voice a rasping whisper that carried an unnatural resonance. "The force that must balance the life you so cherish. The land needs death to survive, and you, seekers of balance, have forgotten that." Marla stepped forward, her staff crackling with light. "We know death is part of the cycle," she said, her voice firm. "We've learned that. But this is something different. This corruption is unnatural." The figure tilted its head, a strange, almost amused gesture. "You think you understand the cycle? You are only children playing with forces beyond your comprehension. The land has its own purpose, its own will. The imbalance you have created will bring destruction. You will learn that the earth does not just seek to renew, it must consume." John's stomach twisted. The words felt like an omen, a warning of something far greater than they could have ever imagined. The land was alive, yes, but not in the way they had thought. It had its own rules, its own hunger. "What are you?" John demanded, his heart racing. "Why are you here?" "I'm the shadow of the earth's hunger," the figure replied. "The decay that follows every bloom, the death that makes way for rebirth. I have always been here, waiting for the right moment. You have made your choice. Now you will see what happens when balance tips too far." The figure raised its hand, and the ground around them began to crack open, dark tendrils of energy rising from the earth like serpents. The trees that surrounded them twisted violently, their bark splitting and curling into jagged shapes. The air grew colder, and the very soil seemed to resist their presence, pushing them back, trying to bury them. "This is not the natural cycle," Marla said, her voice strained. "This is corruption. You speak of balance," the figure hissed, "but you have only delayed the inevitable. The land must consume, and now the time has come for the land to reclaim what you have so foolishly tried to preserve." The ground trembled beneath their feet, and John's pulse quickened. This was no test, no trial. It was an eruption of something far darker, a force that fed on the balance between life and death. John grasped Marla's arm tightly, his mind racing for a solution. They had learned to coexist with the land, but now they faced something that could destroy everything they had worked for. Could they survive this final trial? Or would the land's hunger consume them both? As the shadows closed in around them, the battle for balance was no longer just about understanding, it was about survival. The true test had arrived, and it would push them beyond everything they had ever known. The dark tendrils of decay began to spiral from the ground, coiling up like serpents, their movement unnaturally fast and purposeful. The trees groaned as their trunks twisted and contorted, shedding their bark and revealing veins of blackened energy. The air grew colder, carrying with it the scent of rot and burning ash, as if the very land was dying before their eyes. The figure, the keeper of decay, stood at the center of it all, its hollow eyes staring at them as though waiting for them to understand just how powerless they truly were. John's grip on Marla tightened as the earth beneath them shook violently. The sense of connection he had once felt with the land had been severed. The pulse of life had turned to a steady, throbbing hum, but this time it wasn't a beat of life, it was the pulse of death threatening to drown out everything around it. "What is this?" Marla's voice was a whisper, trembling with fear but not without resolve. "This isn't the natural cycle. It's wrong. It's twisted." The keeper of decay raised its head, a slow, deliberate movement, and it seemed almost amused by their reaction. "You think you understand balance," it croaked, "but you have only seen a small piece of the truth. The land cycle is not just life and death, it is consumption. The land must consume, devour, and renew. And in your ignorance, you have denied it." John stepped forward, his breath shallow, but his resolve firm. "No, we didn't deny the land. We didn't try to stop it. We learned to live with it. We're not enemies. We've been a part of it." "You are part of it," the keeper replied, its voice growing more dissonant, more menacing. "But you are only part of the whole. You have disturbed the land's natural hunger. It has waited for this moment, for the moment when the cycle could no longer be maintained in the way you've tried. Now the hunger will consume everything." As the figure spoke, the tendrils of decay began to spread across the forest floor, corrupting everything they touched. The once vibrant trees withered, their branches snapping and crumbling into dust. The very soil seemed to turn to ash, as if the earth was being drained of its essence. The power they had once felt, this deep, life-giving bond, was now distorted, twisted into something dark and unstoppable. Marla's staff crackled with light, her magic pulsing in a desperate rhythm. "We won't let you destroy the balance. We will fight for the land." The keeper's hollow eyes flickered with an unsettling energy. "You do not understand. The fight is over. You may struggle, but the land has chosen." In a sudden, violent surge, the tendrils of decay shot up from the ground, wrapping around John's legs and pulling him downward toward the blackened earth. His feet sunk deeper into the soil, the blackness spreading up his body like poison. He gritted his teeth, trying to pull himself free, but the more he struggled, the more the decay seemed to tighten its grip. "John!" Marla screamed, rushing to his side. She raised her staff high, channeling her magic into ground, trying to break the tendrils' hold. Light flared from her staff, burning the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The more she fought, the more the shadow seemed to grow, wrapping itself around them both. The keeper of decay stepped forward, its pale face illuminated by the flickering light from Marla's staff. It extended a skeletal hand toward them, and the ground groaned, responding to its will. "You fight the inevitable," the keeper whispered, its voice full of mockery. "But there is no victory in resisting this cycle." John's heart hammered in his chest as the earth beneath him seemed to consume more of him, threatening to drag him into an eternal darkness. The life that had once surged beneath him, the connection he had felt to the pulse of the land, was now a choking force, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the void. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something inside him shifted. He had been fighting the decay, resisting it, but he realized something. Fighting the cycle would only feed into it. The land wasn't just about life. It wasn't just about death. It was about understanding the balance between them. He had to embrace both sides, not fight them. "Marla," John gasped, his voice hoarse. "We have to stop fighting. We have to let go. Trust the cycle. Marla looked down at him, her face contorted with panic, but in his eyes, she saw the clarity of understanding. The decay was not their enemy. It was part of the same cycle they had come to learn about. Death was a necessary force, just as much as life. The key was in understanding how to coexist with it, not how to defeat it. In that moment of realization, John's connection to the earth shifted again, but this time, he didn't try to fight the pull of decay. Instead, he allowed himself to sink deeper into it, feeling the weight of the earth's ancient hunger flow through him. He opened himself to the death, to the darkness, but not with fear. With acceptance. The decay didn't consume him, it integrated with him. He felt the land's hunger, but he also felt its rebirth. The cycle was not about endless destruction, it was about transformation. Life giving way to death, death feeding life. Do you see? The keeper's voice whispered, almost tender now. You have learned. You have embraced the land's hunger. The tendrils that had once pulled him under now seemed to release their grip, slithering away as the earth began to shift to renew itself. The blackened soil began to regenerate, sprouting new, vibrant green shoots. The trees, though still twisted, began to sprout new leaves, their branches slowly reclaiming life. Marla stepped back, her magic flickering as the air around them shifted. The dark figures stood still, watching them as the forest began to heal, the balance slowly but steadily returning. We've learned, John whispered, as the earth seemed to settle beneath his feet once more. We didn't have to fight. We had to understand. The land, it's always changing, and we must change with it. The keeper of decay nodded, its face now expressionless. You have passed the final trial. The balance is yours to protect, to sustain. But remember, the cycle never ends. You will face challenges again and again. The land is eternal, and so are its trials. With those final words, the figure began to dissolve, its form disintegrating into the air like ash in the wind. The last tendrils of decay faded, leaving only the restored forest in their wake, a forest that was alive, not just in its growth, but in its death and rebirth. John and Marla stood in the quiet aftermath, their bodies still trembling from the trial they had just endured. They had passed the test, but they knew that the journey had only just begun. The land was not a place to conquer, but a force to live with, to respect. It was not a peaceful entity, nor a vengeful one. It was a force of nature, ever-changing, always evolving, always in need of balance. And with that, John and Marla realized that they were not just stewards of the land. They were part of it forever. As the final tendrils of decay faded into the earth, John and Marla stood in the center of the now rejuvenated forest, breathing in the cool air that had returned, clean and fresh. The land around them seemed to sigh with relief, its pulse steady once more. Yet, despite the calm, an unspoken weight lingered between them, the awareness that their victory was not the end, but only the beginning of a much deeper journey. They stood there for a moment longer, letting the forest settle, but soon they knew they couldn't linger in the woods forever. There was still the village to return to, and the people they had sworn to protect. The forces they had encountered in the forest, the keeper of decay, the earth's hunger, would not simply disappear. Whatever trials lay ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet foresee. We have to go back, Marla said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice, though calm, had something larger in her eyes. She looked at John and understanding. They'll need to know. They'll need to understand what happened here. John nodded, his thoughts racing. He could feel the connection between himself and the earth, but it was different now, stronger, deeper, but also far more fragile. The balance they had worked so hard to restore had been threatened, and it was clear that the land's trials were not over. Their path, like the land cycle, would continue. As they made their way back through the forest, they noticed subtle changes. Where there had been darkness and rot, the new shoots and blossoms seemed to be fighting through the soil with a renewed energy. The trees, though scarred by the decay, had begun to grow new branches, their leaves vibrant in the dimming light. The forest was healing slowly but surely. The journey back was long, the distance between the heart of the forest and the village stretching farther than they remembered. The road was quiet, the path still damp from the storm that had passed. Yet, it was a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that comes after a storm is cleared, leaving only the remnants of what was. But as they neared the village, a sense of unease began to settle in. John could feel it before they even saw the first of the cottages. The faint but unmistakable pulse of the earth had shifted again, and it was not the calm, steady rhythm they had become accustomed to. Something was wrong. The villagers were gathered in the square, their faces drawn with worry. At first, they didn't notice John and Marla approaching. They were too preoccupied with something more pressing. John's heart tightened as he saw the cause of their concern. There, in the center of the square, lay a massive, twisted tree. Its bark was blackened, as if scorched by fire, and its branches curled in grotesque patterns, reaching out like gnarled hands, grasping at the air. The ground around it was cracked, dry, and lifeless. The pulse of life that had once flowed through the land was absent here, replaced by an eerie stillness. One of the villagers, a woman who had once been a friend of Marla's, approached them, her face pale and drawn with fear. "It's happening again," she whispered, barely audible. "It's spreading." John and Marla exchanged a look, and without a word, they moved toward the tree. As they got closer, the air felt thick and suffocating, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Marla raised her staff, the light from it flickering nervously in the oppressive darkness that surrounded the tree. "What is it?" Marla asked, her voice firm, though the tremor beneath her words was unmistakable. "Where did this come from?" The woman shook her head. "We don't know. It just appeared a few days ago, and since then, it's been growing, slowly but steadily, in the land. It's changing. It feels wrong." John knelt before the tree, reaching out with his senses. The pulse of the earth was there, but it was faint, and distorted. The energy of the land seemed to be siphoning away from this spot, draining into the twisted roots of the tree. The decay they had witnessed in the forest was not confined to one place. It was now spreading faster than they could have anticipated. "It's the corruption," John murmured, his voice low. "It's spreading out from the heart of the forest. The land is sick." Marla's expression darkened as she surveyed the tree, her brow furrowed in concentration. "But how? We dealt with it. The Keeper of Decay. It's not supposed to return so quickly." John stood, his mind racing. The Keeper had warned them. The cycle was eternal. Life, death, rebirth, and the land had its own will. But this was something else. Something deeper. "Maybe we didn't stop it," he said, his voice tight with realization. "Maybe we only postponed it." "What are you saying?" Marla asked, turning to face him. John looked down at the twisted tree, his eyes narrowing. "We've been protecting the balance, but we've only scratched the surface. The cycle of decay is not just the land's natural process. There's a force that feeds it, that drives it, and we may have unleashed something much more dangerous by dealing with the Keeper of Decay in the way we did." Marla's eyes widened, and a sense of dread passed over her. "You think we set something loose? Something worse?" The wind shifted suddenly, swirling around them, the ground beneath their feet trembling. The pulse of the earth grew louder, and as it did, the villagers backed away, fear evident in their eyes. The ground cracked open with a sudden and violent roar, and from the deep fissures rose a form unlike anything they had seen before, a shadowy figure, its body shifting and rippling like smoke, its features indiscernible. It towered above them, its presence suffocating. This was no keeper, no guardian of the land. This was the force of decay, the hunger of the earth itself, manifest. "I warned you," the voice echoed in their minds, deep and reverberating. "The balance is fragile. you have broken it. Now the land's hunger will consume everything in its path. The villagers screamed in terror, scrambling to flee, but the creature's shadow spread, cutting them off from escape. John and Marla stood together, their faces set in grim determination. The real trial was beginning now. The Earth's hunger had awakened in a form far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. And they were the only ones who stood between it and the village, the only ones who could fight to restore the balance once again. The true battle for the land's soul had begun. The silence that followed the Keeper's departure was almost reverent. The Earth felt still, as though holding its breath, allowing the ripples of the event to settle. The trees, once corrupted, were now slowly but surely returning to their original vitality. The air was fresher, and the scent of decay was gone, replaced by the fragrance of moss and wildflowers, as if the forest was reclaiming its health. Even the very soil seemed to hum with a new energy, a life force pulsing beneath their feet. John and Marla stood together, surrounded by the recovering forest, their minds still processing the weight of what had transpired. They had faced the land's hunger, had walked through the fire of its decay, and had emerged, if not unscathed, then transformed. "What now?" Marla asked softly, her voice filled with wonder and uncertainty. She turned her gaze toward John, her staff still glowing faintly in the dim light of the settling evening. John didn't answer right away. He was still feeling the remnants of the battle, the pull of decay, the taste of death, and yet the pulse of renewal that had followed. His connection to the land had deepened in a way that words couldn't fully describe. He felt the vastness of the world's cycle, its ongoing dance of life, death, and rebirth, and the knowledge that he was no longer an outsider, but a part of that eternal rhythm. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but soft, as though speaking to the very earth beneath him. "Now we live with it. We take what we've learned and use it to protect the balance. But I don't think we can return to the way things were." Marla nodded in agreement, her eyes far away, lost in the thought of what the land had shown them. "We can't go back, not after what we've seen." She hesitated, then added, "The people, they won't understand, will they? They'll see the forest healed, but they won't understand the true nature of what we've faced." John's gaze drifted to the distant village that lay beyond the edge of the forest, barely visible in the twilight. The people there had always looked to them for guidance, for wisdom in matters of land. They had seen John and Marla as protectors, as stewards of nature. But that perception would change, would have to change. What they had learned, the depth of it, was too vast for most to grasp. And if they tried to explain it, it would only create fear and uncertainty. "No," John said softly, his thoughts beginning to take shape. "They won't understand. Not completely. They'll see the restoration, the land's healing, but they won't feel what we felt. They won't understand the cost of that healing. But we can't just keep it to ourselves," Marla replied, her voice tight with concern. "The balance is fragile. If they don't understand the importance of it, it could all unravel." "I know," John agreed, rubbing his hand over his face, feeling the weight of their responsibility. "But we'll have to find a way to help them understand. Slowly. We can't rush it. They have to learn that the land's hunger isn't something to fight against, but something to coexist with. We can show them, but we can't force them to see it." Marla looked toward the village, her eyes narrowed with determination. "We'll show them," she said firmly. "We'll teach them, one step at a time." Just as John was about to reply, a distant noise caught his attention, a faint murmur like voices on the wind. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. No, this was something else, something urgent. He turned toward Marla, his gaze sharp. "Do you hear that?" Marla tensed, her staff raised slightly in anticipation. "I hear it. It sounds like voices or something moving." Without another word, they moved quickly toward the edge of the clearing, where the path to the village lay. The murmur grew louder as they approached, but it was indistinct, as if something or someone was calling out in distress. As they emerged from the dense trees into the open space near the village, they saw a group of villagers gathered in the square, their faces etched with confusion and fear. They were looking toward the horizon, where dark clouds were beginning to gather, swirling ominously above the village. The air felt thick, heavy with tension, and John could feel it. Something was wrong. The ground beneath their feet shuddered slightly, a faint tremor that was almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It wasn't the land's natural pulse. This was something else. Something unnatural. "What's happening?" Marla whispered. Before John could respond, an old villager, a woman named Anwin, stepped forward from the group, her face pale and weathered, her eyes wide with fear. "The land. It's angry again," she said in a hoarse voice. "The crops are dying. The river's turning red. Something's wrong. Terribly wrong." John's chest tightened as he exchanged a glance with Marla. This wasn't a natural cycle. This wasn't the balance they had helped restore. This was something else entirely. "We need to go to the river," John said urgently. "Now." Without waiting for a response, he turned and began to move toward the village's edge, with Marla close behind him. The river that ran near the village had always been a vital source of life, but something had poisoned it, something dark, something malevolent. As they made their way through the village, they passed the panicked villagers, their faces grim with worry. Whispers spread like wildfire. The earth had been healed, they knew that, but now something worse had emerged. The land had spoken of decay, of hunger, but now it seemed as though that hunger had found a new, insidious form. When they reached the river, John's heart sank. The water that had once flowed clear and pure was now a deep, ominous red, swirling in unnatural patterns. The very earth around it was cracked and dry, the soil blackened as though scorched by a fire that never reached the flames. Marla knelt beside the river, her fingers brushing the surface of the water, recoiling in horror. "This isn't natural. This is something else. It's spreading." John stepped back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This isn't the land cycle. This is someone is disrupting it. The decay wasn't just about the earth. It was about control. Marla looked at him, her expression grim. "You think someone's using the decay as a weapon?" "I don't know," John said, his mind racing. "But I have a feeling this is only the beginning." As the sky above them darkened, the wind picked up, carrying with it a strange, cold energy that felt like a warning. They had thought they had restored balance to the land, but something else was coming, something more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The trials were far from over, and the true test of their understanding was only just beginning. The air grew heavy as John and Marla stood by the river, its crimson waters swirling unnaturally beneath the darkened sky. The sense of dread that had settled in the village now clung to the land itself, like a palpable weight that suffocated all hope. The unnatural pulse of decay was spreading faster than they could have imagined, and the villagers were beginning to panic. It was clear that the battle was far from over, and now, the true nature of the force threatening them had begun to reveal itself. "What is it?" Marla asked, her voice barely more than a whisper as she gazed at the river. "What could be causing this?" John's eyes flickered over the river, the cracks in the earth, and the unnatural red hue of the water. He could feel it. This wasn't just a sickness of the land. This was deliberate. Someone or something had poisoned the very lifeblood of the village. But who? And why? "I don't know yet," John replied, his voice strained with urgency. "But I have a feeling that this is no accident. Someone's manipulating the decay, using it as a weapon, a way to control the land. Then we have to stop them," Marla said, her voice hardening with resolve. "If this continues, the land will die. We've seen what the decay can do. We can't let it spread." "We won't," John said, his hand tightening around the staff he had carried since the beginning. "But first, we need to understand where it's coming from. The corruption is like a sickness. There must be a source." Marla nodded, her gaze narrowing as she stood up. "We need to find that source, before it's too late. Together, They began to move along the river's bank, searching for any signs of the cause. The ground around them was dry and cracked, and the air itself seemed to hum with an oppressive energy. As they walked, the unnatural coldness in the air grew stronger, and soon, the forest surrounding the village felt distant, as if the corruption had drawn the very life from it. Then, without warning, the land beneath their feet trembled, and the sky above them darkened further. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed through their minds. "You should not have interfered." John froze, his body tensing with the sudden realization that the force they were facing was no mere elemental. It was something far older, far more dangerous. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice defiant. From the shadows ahead, a figure emerged, cloaked in tattered robes. Its form was barely discernible, its presence a void of darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. As it stepped forward, the land beneath it withered, the trees bending toward the figure as if in homage. The air grew colder still, and John felt a chill deep within his bones. "I'm the one who has waited," the figure said, its voice echoing in the air like a long-forgotten chant. "I am the hunger of the earth, the one who sleeps beneath its surface. You have awakened me, and now I will take back what was once mine." Marla stepped forward, her eyes narrowed with defiance. "You were banished long ago. The cycle of decay was meant to serve the land, not consume it. What have you become?" The figure chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down their spines. "I have become the land's true nature, its primal hunger. It is not life that sustains this world, but death. You, foolish mortals, have disrupted that balance, and now you will suffer the consequences." The air grew thick with an almost tangible malice as the figure raised a hand, and the earth trembled beneath their feet. John and Marla struggled to maintain their footing as the figure's power surged through the land, twisting the very ground beneath them. "We won't let you do this," John shouted, his voice filled with determination. He raised his staff, summoning the energy of the land to fight back. "The land belongs to the living, not to you." The figure's laugh echoed again, but it was cut short by a sudden force that blasted from the earth itself, a surge of energy that cracked the ground open, sending the figure stumbling back. The air shimmered as the power of the earth fought against the figure's corruption. But it wasn't enough. The figure regained its balance, and, with a wave of its hand, the land began to warp once more. The trees around them shriveled and died as the earth beneath them began to split open, darkness spilling from the cracks. "We were never meant to live in harmony with the earth," the figure hissed. "The land is meant to consume. It is hungry." John and Marla exchanged a glance, knowing they had no choice but to take a final stand. The earth's pulse, the true rhythm of the world, still beat within them, but now it felt distant, almost overwhelmed by the figure's power. With a final, desperate cry, they both raised their staffs together, the energy of the land flooding their bodies. In a blinding flash, the power of the earth surged through them, forming a barrier of light and life that pushed back against the figure's darkness. The figure screamed, its form contorting and writhing as the light of the land consumed it. But even as it howled in pain, its grip on the land tightened. The corruption spread, slowly but surely, and John and Marla realized the truth. They could push it back, they could fight, but the cycle of decay was not something that could ever be entirely destroyed. It was an eternal force, a part of the land itself. They had only one choice: to contain it. The land was in turmoil, the battle between life and decay raging across the riverbanks, through the village, and deep into the heart of the forest. But even as John and Marla fought with every ounce of their strength, they knew the truth. The hunger was not a force they could defeat outright. It was part of the Earth's nature, its dark twin, always there, waiting for the moment to resurface. John stood with his staff raised, the energy of the land flowing through him. Beside him, Marla's hands crackled with the same power, but even she could feel the toll the fight was taking. The very land beneath their feet seemed to pulse with the rhythm of death, as if the earth itself was resisting them. "We have to make the sacrifice," John said, his voice grim. Marla nodded, understanding. "The balance must be maintained. We can't kill it, but we can contain it." With a final, desperate push, they called on the power of the earth, its life force, its very essence. They didn't just fight the hunger, they merged with it, binding it to the land itself, keeping it at bay. As the energy surged, the figure screamed one last time, its form dissolving into the wind, into the earth. The land itself seemed to tremble, then fall into silence. When the dust settled, John and Marla stood alone in the clearing, the land around them still and quiet. The sky had cleared, and the stars now shone brightly above. But the silence was not peaceful. The battle was over for now, and the cycle of decay would never truly end. The land had been saved, but at a great cost. The hunger would always be a part of it, waiting in the shadows. John and Marla turned back to the village, knowing that their work was not finished. They had given the land a chance at renewal, but it was up to the people to understand that the earth could not be tamed, only respected. The true guardians of the land had fought for its soul, and now the land would decide its own fate.